A man telling everyone to pack everything and soon after it will go straight to their homes. Meanwhile, someone seems to be drinking something, giving everyone a good task, mentioning that he was already leaving. The man asks if he didn't want to have dinner with them, but the young man replies that he has things to do the next day. Then the other guy says he just wanted to know what y'all ate, since he was the only one who didn't seem tired after work. The truth was that the young man always took vitamins early, wondering if it was possible to gain so much power from them. Meanwhile, the boy was thinking that vitamins have the best value when one is tired. The young man's name is Park Han-yul, and he is 22 years old, and he got the best effects by getting high with the drugs he used. That's how he discovered his special attribute during his military service, after eating the supplements his companion had given him. Even after a day of training, his fatigue went away with just 2 vitamins in a day, and the omega-3 cleared his mind, increasing his concentration. Sometime later, the young man seems to be getting off a bus. Thinking that he should buy a coffee at the convenience store on his way back. Looking to the side, he suddenly notices something. Then a girl appears, staring at him with a certain desperation. Saying that this was the first time she was going to tell this to someone, and the protagonist in his thoughts assumes that the girl is confessing to him. Happy, the young man asks how he can help her. However, it wasn't what the boy was expecting, as the girl was just trying to deceive him, inviting him to a cult. As she walked away, the girl said she wasn't a bad person, and that her name was Han-yuni. Starting to run, the boy wishes her a good day, thinking that there were still people like that, and that he was completely tired of cults and saints because of his own father. His father used to be a very stable person. However, one day he ended up saying that he had made a very important decision, deciding that he would make medicines to become a saint. After his father said those shocking words, he quit his job and moved to his parents' house in the countryside, and he consumed a mix of medications and other ingredients, but he was taken to the hospital countless times after having a stomach ache. Then, one day, he went into nature because nothing was working, leaving a ride, saying he would return with energy. However, that happened 20 years ago. That was when he, Park Han-yul, was only 2 years old. While buying more vitamins, he thinks that it was a long time ago, and his mother went through hardships since his father had disappeared so long ago. Moreover, his father could have taken supplements like him instead of weird medications. As he leaves the store, he suddenly notices something strange, and a gigantic circle appears in the middle of the sky. Everyone around had no idea what it was. The protagonist, on his part, thinks that when he entered, he didn't see anything like that. But he didn't think it was some kind of art, assuming it could be a type of spaceship. At that moment, the ground begins to tremble. Several people around start panicking, and Park calmly observes the situation. As the ground splits, a hand starts to emerge from the crack, and a horrifying monster begins to rise. Standing before the protagonist, it seems to be a type of demon. At that moment, it starts advancing towards the boy. Desperate, he thinks he has to get out of that place. Then, his heart seems to start beating faster, and a message warns that it will begin using the nutrients. The demon, about to attack the boy, hears that message, which again warns that energy has been provided. Thus, his senses and reflexes were enhanced. Then, in a matter of seconds, the boy manages to dodge the attack, feeling confused because that blow was very slow. Amidst the situation, he wonders what had happened, questioning whether by chance he had monstrous power like that all along, assuming that it could be because of those supplements. So, for that reason, he could now flee easily. However, he notices that the other people around weren't as lucky, as they were being slaughtered by other demons, leaving Park irritated by what he was seeing. Starting to run, he thinks that in that state, he had a good chance of winning the battle. Soon after, he kicks the monster, which ends up flying out of the ground. At the same moment, both rushes to grab the club, which, successfully, Park manages to grab, striking the demon on the head, thinking that it was much weaker than he had supposed. Soon after, several monsters charge at him. However, the protagonist defeats them one by one, and in a matter of seconds, he is already surrounded by bodies on the ground. Wondering what happened, the boy then looks up, not believing what he was seeing. Because a giant demon was standing before him, noticing his companions on the ground. Park thinks he should try to fight, because maybe the demon could also be weaker. But in a matter of seconds, that monster was already attacking the young man. Then blood starts to gush. Meanwhile, several people were still fighting those demons. The man asks what would happen if the monsters went to that place, and the other says he's also scared, asking to close that door. At that moment, someone is thrown into that place, hitting the two who were inside the store. In front of them, a giant demon stood. Desperate, the young man begs not to be killed, begging for someone to save him. At that same moment, someone seems to be smoking a cigarette, and the system announces that the elixir has been consumed. In a matter of seconds, a protagonist charges at the demon, landing a kick on it, managing to throw the demon far away. In a very frantic pose, the protagonist appears. The system announces that adrenaline had surged in his body. Park in turn says they should start round 2. Charging at the demon again, landing a punch on its face. Then he delivers a sequence of punches, but at that moment, the demon charges back, even so the protagonist manages to dodge, saying it seemed like he was still full of energy, landing another punch on its face, telling it to taste that, smashing the demon's face into the asphalt, successfully managing to defeat that demon, saying that it seemed like the cigarettes also had an effect on his body and hoped his mother was okay. However, at that same moment, the demon rises again, and as a consequence, it grabs Park's head, punching it and throwing him to the ground. But just barely, Park manages to hold its H and delivering a punch to its stomach, which now finally and successfully knocks out the demon, mentioning that he was very tired and couldn't even move. However, he notices something else, as the other people weren't able to escape from those demons. Quickly trying to get up, he finds he has no energy left. Wondering where those demons were coming from and why they were attacking normal people, begging them to stop. Soon after, a demon grabs a man, and the protagonist was just standing there, watching the situation. Then the demon was about to finish off that poor man. However, a person was in the air. Grabbing a piece of paper, it seemed to cast a spell, managing to defeat several demons. Park, surprised, realizes they managed to defeat all the demons at once, wondering who that man was and if he was really a person. Then the girl says the protagonist did very well, asking how he managed to kill a demon like that without any training, asking who he might be. Meanwhile, the protagonist watches without any reaction. The girl says she needs to see how much potential he has, asking him to extend his hand. However, Park was still confused by all of this, but the girl seems to cast a spell that pulls his H, and which she then begins to analyze, not believing what she was seeing before her, thinking that it wasn't celestial or earthly. But still, it wasn't human, which could be explained as an irregular being. Although it's sad that this child was chosen, she couldn't allow someone to become a disaster that is left alive. Starting to use magic, she thinks she needed to get rid of him now. Then the boy thanks her for her help, saying that if she hadn't helped, something bad would have definitely happened. And for that reason, he didn't know how to thank that woman. Observing what the boy had said, she falls silent, thinking that it was a pity that his manners and his pure energy were a waste. Throwing a pill into the boy's mouth, which as a result, he ends up swallowing. Realizing it was very bitter, he questions what the woman had given him. And at that moment, the young man falls to the ground, and the woman replies that it was a medicine used to seal the center of his energy. Although it's not used to seal demons that can't be controlled, this was the only way to save his life. Because one day his irregular powers will ruin his life and the world around him. Even though the boy might suffer, it was for a greater good. Asking the boy not to hate her, and if fate allows, they will meet again. Soon after, that girl, without even saying her name, walks away, and the protagonist ends up falling to the ground. Wondering what he had done for that woman to give him that medicine, and what she meant by that word irregular. And if it had anything to do with his special attribute. Getting up, he asks not to make him laugh, because if he didn't have those powers, he would be on the ground with his skull cracked open. Quickly, the young man goes to a store. Grabbing a supplement, he starts drinking it, and the system announces that the drug has been consumed. Park thinks that from that day on, he will use these powers to survive. Sometime later, the young man was already at home stocked with supplements, saying that hangover drinks also work on his body, remembering that the girl had mentioned a disaster, and that the medicine she had given him must have some effect on him. But for now, he will grab everything he needs and head straight to his mother. At that moment, his phone starts ringing and a message from the government appears, saying that monsters were everywhere, and that message asks him to download the department's app to get more information about all that. About to download the app, the protagonist notices that the name was Special Precautions Number 24, assuming they just created it because the design was terrible. Grabbing his phone, he starts scanning his ID, and the app announces that authentication was complete, and that he would now be redirected to the app. At that moment, several strange letters start appearing around the boy. Not understanding anything, Park wonders what is happening. The system announces that they confirmed he had a spiritual physique, and for that reason, they would begin analyzing his body. Park thinks that it was similar to what the woman had said, and that it could be something related to the irregularity that might appear again. Soon after, the boy seems to feel some kind of pain, wondering why this had to happen now. Because the effects of that medicine were probably already kicking in. Then at that moment, the boy begins drinking his supplements again, thinking that now he felt much better. However, that message was still analyzing his physique, and soon after it announces that Park's analysis results had been concluded. There was a blue void material, and its color represented trees. The chance of obtaining water from that material was extremely rare, and its name was bluish fuel. They called it that because it worked like a condensed elixir, and held the energy of the entire Earth. Meanwhile, Park was still waiting for the system's response. The energy of the blue matter was an ingredient in the medicine the protagonist had taken, and since the effects of the hangover drink cured the poisonous effect, only the energy of the blue matter had remained in his body. Thus, something very interesting ended up happening to Park's body. The protagonist, desperate, realizes that his body was very hot, so he thought it would be better to wait for his fever to go down. However, the boy felt very restless, still wondering if there was some way to feel more comfortable. Then right after, he seems to have an idea. Supposing that the best way would be meditating, mentioning that this wasn't one of the positions practiced by those people in martial arts movies. Besides, that position was very comfortable. So he will stay like that until his fever goes down. Park says he should have a regular physique, complaining about his mundane body. Then the system announces that the results show the protagonist had a mundane body full of tree energy. The boy thinks she gave him a medicine because he was considered irregular, wondering what that meant with the tree energies. Moreover, it seemed that the effects of the poison had disappeared. Wondering if the effects of the ingredients changed while he was being analyzed? Even so, it was a relief as he could have been killed if the analysis showed he was irregular. However, a different colored system appears and from it, a man emerges, greeting all the citizens of Korea, saying he wanted to mention that everything he was going to say from now on was completely true. 10,000 years ago, the world was in a much more spectacular place than it is now, because those beings we call monsters roamed the Earth, while other beings from other worlds crossed galaxies to reach Earth. At that time, humans were killed and discarded. Amidst that chaos, a few chosen ones were granted spiritual physiques, a special power they didn't possess before. This acquired power gave humans a life expectancy comparable to that of monsters. Thus, it signaled the beginning of a world where Hanyong could wield great powers. Then later, these people were named monks, and in order to close the gates to heaven, they ended up sacrificing their lives for a greater good, making it so that humans could thrive on Earth for eternity. These people were remembered as myths and legends, and their stories were passed down through generations. Thus, they continued protecting the gates as humanity progressed. Or at least, that was how it went until a few hours ago. All the chosen monks will be patrolling their designated areas to protect the safety of all humanity. And also, these people have been tested for their abilities, which gives them the right to enforce the law when necessary. Meanwhile, Park was still analyzing that system, wondering if this is what it meant by finding suitable skills for his aptitudes. At that moment, several other screens begin to appear in his vision, wondering if everything around him was skills. Realizing that it was indeed the case, because those are all the parts where he could feel the heat emanating. Additionally, in that image, the protagonist was in the same position. After training systematically for a certain period of time, you can emanate heat from at least one of these three places, and once those three places start to heat up, you should begin the training of the ground path. Until yesterday, he didn't believe in religion or anything like that, but now he was practicing this sacred breathing technique. Right after, the boy seems to start meditating. Surprise, because it was much easier than he had thought. Assuming that, even if he had a spiritual body, it takes time to feel the energy gathering in the three cores. That could take months or even years for some, as it depended more on their talent. With enough training, one can reach a state of emptiness and unconsciousness, even of one's surroundings. Thus, Park took his first step toward becoming a monk. When he opens his eyes, he ends up confused because several plants were surrounding his body, wondering what all that was and how long he had been in that position. Grabbing his phone, he realizes that its battery had died. Therefore, he should have a clock somewhere to check the time. However, when he looks, he sees that it was June 22nd, completely surprised because 100 days had passed while he was meditating. Sometime later, the boy had already taken a shower, happy, because there was still water. assuming it was very strange, as his injuries were healed and he didn't feel very hungry. Moreover, he hadn't lost much weight. Instead, he had become much stronger. Grabbing his phone, he notices it was charging, wondering if perhaps he should check the news. However, when he looked outside earlier, there was a barrier in the shape of a giant dome. Wondering how there were holes with monsters coming out, and that area was probably an extreme danger zone. At that moment, he realizes that another earthquake had occurred. However, it was just a horrifying figure walking across the field. Desperate, the protagonist wonders what that was, as there were several demons surrounding those buildings, thinking he needed to get out of that place immediately. However, he realizes that there was no signal in that place. So, calling for emergency help was his only option. Thinking that he had put his temperature to sleep with the breathing technique and survived 100 days in the lotus position. Right after, a system appears welcoming Park, mentioning that he wasn't connected to a network and that some features require a connection. Looking at the system, the boy wonders if there was nothing in that place he could use. Additionally, the only thing that opened was his profile with his information, and also, a strange thing called that had 2 available charm copies. The system announces that there were 3 usable charms, and depending on the user's nickname and ranking, higher level charms are given. And the first one was called Soft Steps, a special 9th rank magic. The boy thinks it was very easy, wondering if that was all he had to do. But still, he didn't feel any change in his body. At that moment, when he tries to take just a small step, he ends up hitting his face against the wall. Saying that the special magic contracted was indeed real, wondering what the other abilities were. Then it is revealed that he had one of the abilities that would allow him to carry more weight, and the other was able to create a tornado of light. Park, surprised, wonders if perhaps he should use that on the roof. However, the problem was that the monsters could see the light and come after him. Moreover, he had copied the breathing technique last time, wondering if he should take a closer look. The system announces that the trainee is divided from 1 to 10 stars, and after the 5th star, he could use nature techniques. Park, in turn, is surprised because he could also increase the levels. However, his hopes are dashed because it would take at least 10 years to raise a star. And for that reason, he would need at least 70 years to use one of those. Nevertheless, the young man says he would check how many stars he had first. That was how he could assess himself, by placing energy into both hands and checking the energy rings on his left hand. Thus, he began channeling energy into his hands. The number of rings on his hand represented his star level. However, the boy seemed surprised by what he saw. At that very moment, a monster began charging toward him. So, he needed to find something quickly to help him. In a matter of seconds, a tiger was already at his door, starting to attack the protagonist, tearing into his shoulder. In ancient China, there was a skill called the absorption method. A skill capable of stealing the vitality of a beast, and the protagonist chose something similar to that ability. Then the boy, incredibly, ended up using a 6th level art, successfully defeating that beast. Meanwhile, the green aura began to surround the boy, saying that he only survived because he found a very useful ability. But, at that same moment he collapsed to the ground. The system announced that a muscle had formed and his blood was stable, and the production of red blood cells had drastically increased. Then a green glow began to emanate from the protagonist's eye. Looking at his and Park wondered what was happening. Why he could feel an enormous amount of energy flowing throughout his entire body. Supposing that it was because his nutrients were replenished when he absorbed the energy from that monster. Even so, it was great as this much should be enough to hold up after using the light tornado. Looking to the side, he noticed that some plants were sprouting from the monster's body, saying that definitely wasn't there before, and so he should pick them up as they might be useful. While walking, he realized he could only use one sprout at a time, and if he had time to absorb the energy from monsters before finishing them, he could do something much better. However, he thought it was better to avoid too many problems, as he needed to hold on until the rescue team arrived. Observing the light tornado ability, he thought he would need to use it at some point. At that moment, another monster appeared, charging toward the boy once again. As a result, he began using that ability again. Landing a punch on that monster, thinking that there wasn't any time to relax and he needed to get up quickly and call for rescue with his light tornado ability. But every time he kept encountering monsters like that, and countless times he simply started defeating them. But even so, it never ended and kept coming back. Sometime later, the boy ended up reaching the rooftop of that building, completely surprised by what he was seeing, because a gigantic monster was standing next to him. Watching the situation, the boy thought he was going crazy, and at that moment, another monster appeared behind him. But even so, Park thought it was all or nothing, charging toward that giant monster. Then he began using that light tornado ability. Sometime later, a voice asked where the protagonist was, asking the boy to come out now. Noticing a man flying, Park sent a signal, indicating that he was down below. The man in turn questioned why Park was just standing there, and asked if he didn't have a talisman to fly, or at least jump. But the boy said he only had the 3 he had gotten earlier. The man, saying that was very boring, asked the boy to extend his hand, wondering what the boy was doing and if he couldn't hear. But the boy pointed out that there was a monster behind him. In a matter of seconds, the man seemed to use a talisman, effortlessly defeating that monster, telling him not to make him repeat himself and to extend his hand, asking who he was to be wandering around a restricted area and if he didn't value his life. Park, about to explain what happened. The man said it didn't matter because he didn't need to know that. So, our boy thanked him for saving him. Leaving that barrier, Park thought it scared him, because there were countless notifications from his mother. But he understood that as he had been trapped in that place for 100 days, and he was very happy that his mother and his relatives were fine, thinking that many things had happened during that time, wondering how different everything could be now. Sometime later the boy was in a building telling his mother that he wanted to call her again, mentioning that it was nothing as he had been lost, but had found his way back, and for that reason he would see her again in a few days. The other guy asked if he had finished his call, and the protagonist said yes, thinking he was relieved that his relatives and his mother seemed safe. Soon after, the man seemed to rush into the room, desperate, wondering if the protagonist was who he thought. Then the man introduced him, saying that he was one of the disciples under the command of the Ryujin unit. However, the man seemed uninterested in that, asking the other officer to leave the place, ordering him to do it, and not to make him repeat himself again. Shortly after, the man asks if he had learned his sentence even before his heavenly gate opened. The protagonist replies that he had not. Then the man asks if he was worthy of waking his sleeping master. Park, in turn, coldly observed the situation. Then a system screen appeared in front of him, and the man asked if the boy could see it, asking if it said Ascendant, and whether there was a total of 9 high ranks. Most of the awakened ones were disciples who could be called saints, and the mundane rank was the highest. However, that man had been recognized for his qualifications, and ended up being qualified as an Ascendant under his master. Age and ethnicity didn't matter, as the person who accumulated the most disciple training was the senior, and not necessarily the younger one. That's why Park had to do his best for his senior, as that was the unspoken rule. Park asks if the Ascendant was the lowest rank, and what rank his master was, irritating the man, who asked him not to speak of what he didn't know. He mentioned that Park had been born with a spiritual physique. So, if he wanted to survive in that world, he had to stay under the protection of his superiors. For that reason, there wouldn't be a second chance, and if he said that again, he would die. However, Park says he had heard that no one could change masters 3 times. So, the man might have been following that master, because he thought his way of speaking was very interesting. This left the man completely furious with what he had heard. But at that moment, a system screen appeared, showing all the protagonist's information, saying that he thought the man had mentioned that rank was the closest one after Ascendant. Standing up, Park says he needed to do his best for his superior. Sometime later, that man was arguing with his master, asking if he had treated his senior as he had been told, and if he was saying that he had handed over the technique he had used. Irritated, he says he was very foolish, because he wanted to say he inherited the technique of a bandit, and lowered his head to that man. However, the man says that his performance range was greater than his own, which is why he was a high saint. His master says that it could be due to his body's condition. But the man says that if that were the case, he certainly could have an irregular physique. This leaves the man even more annoyed, questioning if he would keep saying such foolish things, and if he was implying that the boy was born with a mundane physique like the 2 of them. The man asks if that means his training is more accelerated. However, the master didn't even know that, because even originally, it was difficult to see a human incline toward nature. Humans once came out of the water and then returned to the land. They mastered fire to fend off the cold and melted iron to refine it. Although there are great similarities between living things, their relationships are quite incompatible. The master says that the report to help her is likely, because it was an extremely rare case, and if he understood, he shouldn't mention anything about the construction method. Because they would deliver a drug to be careful with when his breathing stabilizes. Observing the situation, his master thinks it is very fascinating, thinking that the star wind only exists for those inclined toward nature, wondering how he had never heard of such a thing. Meanwhile, Park was at home, working on his computer, thinking that, according to the government's announcement, there wasn't a single person who had an irregular physique. In all nations, the few people who had an irregular physique in spiritual and physical tests were isolated. However, our protagonist hadn't been caught yet. The irregular physique was spiritual and broadly divided into 3 types, which were the celestial, mundane, and human physiques. However, the 4th was an unpredictable spiritual physique that could appear. Even in the past decade, when saints disappeared, the monsters still tried to interfere in the world. Therefore, to prevent them from doing harm, the saints united and banished them from that place. For that reason, their existence was nothing more than legends and tales. Furthermore, there were 2 examples of that. Because it did make sense to think that he should be banished, as he wasn't a famous serial killer. While drinking his coffee, the system informs him that the drug was consumed, saying that even in that bag of brown rice tea, it's worth trembling when you see someone obtaining its maximum effectiveness. And he thought he had gotten a mundane physique result in the spiritual physical test, and because of that, the blue matter from Brazil was given to him. While he didn't know how long the drug would last, he was trying to find something with similar effects, but there was nothing reliable. For that reason, he thought there might be a limit to the information that could be spread to the private sector. But at that moment, the boy seems to have an idea. He searches the word drugs in his search bar, finding some information similar to what he was looking for. Observing the seeds, he wonders what they were, wondering if those seeds were the ones he had seen before. While holding the seeds, Park remembers that he had obtained them when he fought with a beast, and thought they were more common than he had initially believed. Upon researching online, he sees that there were no images about the germination of those seeds. Then he makes an anonymous post asking if Hanyun had seen those seeds before. Those seeds were purgatory herbs, an herb that grows naturally near the river Styx, and if eaten raw, would make a person sick. However, the conditions for germination were restrictive, making it extremely difficult to obtain germinated seeds. But the protagonist thinks that the ones he had were already germinated. So, he decides to experiment with the UN germinated ones, deciding to use the solar wind breathing technique on the seeds, which in turn start growing the boy's hands. A man enters the room shouting. However, the young man was no longer there. The man wonders if he had escaped. He then searches the room to see if the protagonist had stolen anything. Opening the refrigerator, he discovers that the boy had taken one of his peaches. Elsewhere, Park continues experimenting with the seeds. Soon after, a small tree grows. Park Hanyul says that he had only breathed for 2 hours and it had already grown a lot, admiring his accomplishment, thinking that through breathing, energy is exchanged with everything around him. As expected, the solar wind technique had the power to make plants grow, and if he continued cultivating herbs using that, he wouldn't have any problems living as an irregular. Then the boy consumes the sprout of the purgatory herb. While breathing, the young man thinks about how the heat was spreading similarly to the blue matter. However, the red aura disappears and the protagonist wonders if he had done something wrong, trying again. But the aura disappears as well. Park Hanyul says he thought it was working, and wonders why part of it remained in his lower abdomen. He is confused, wondering if it was because the blue matter from the void was a higher quality drug. While chewing the sprout, he decides to try again. The red aura returns, but this time the heat was different. He then remembers what the internet posts said about yin energy. The purgatory herb had a yin nature, while the blue matter from the void had a yang nature. Park Hanyul then wonders if this meant he needed to learn an energy absorption technique for yin energy. But if he encountered mixed energies, his life could be in danger as before. In any case, he thinks that it's a relief because despite the low efficacy, the power could increase. Then the young man uproots the small tree. But a noise ends up startling him. It's just a message on his phone. Upon reading the message, it says that the Majesty's son had died and warns everyone to be careful of the rain, asking all residents to evacuate immediately. People panic, wondering why they weren't warned sooner. Then, a heavy rain begins and moorings appear in the streets. People say it would be less dangerous if they didn't touch them. The protagonist notices that there was a protective barrier around the building, and feels relieved for having followed those people there. Outside the building, someone screams for help. A huge, monstrous bird stands before a woman, and the protagonist is shocked by what he's seeing. The bird uses its claws to lift the woman, throwing her into its nest full of worms. The monster then observes the people inside the barrier. A frightened man says that if he had been late, it would have been him in that situation. Then, Park Han-yeol activates his abilities. Thinking that letting a healthy person die made no sense, so he steps out of the barrier to face the creature. He lands a blow on the bird's head. It falls easily to the ground. The protagonist thinks that he didn't remember being that strong, and wonders if it was because of the purgatory herbs he had consumed earlier. But he realizes that the intense rain was the tears of the Dragon King, and the boy had consumed them. The water made the trees grow more and become stronger, because it activates and amplifies his energy from the element of nature. Now the boy could do anything. Therefore, he decides to use artifact refinement on his tree, which now became a demon slayer. Then the bird rises again, furious, and charges toward the young man. However, he defends himself, thinking that if he let his guard down, he would be pushed back, and didn't have much time left before hitting the protective barrier, so he needed to hold on. Soon after, the creature opens a gap and the boy takes advantage and attacks the monster, realizing that the attack hadn't even scratched it. He wonders if it was because of the demon-slaying blade. The bird gets up again, its eyes fixed on the blade. However, it decides to attack the woman on the ground. But the boy saves her. The woman thanks him, and he replies that it was still too early for her to feel relieved. The bird becomes enraged upon seeing them trying to escape. It strikes them. The wounded manages to return inside the barrier. But Park Han-yeol wasn't as lucky and crashed into a wall. However, the boy stands up, relieved as he had no fractures thanks to the layers, although the effect had worn off. The monster flies to attack the protagonist again. He smiles, thinking that it burned that big flying was a total farce. Then he realizes he couldn't run to the shelter anymore, because the drug's effect was wearing off, and he was already weakening. He wonders if he should plant sprouts. However, it would be difficult to use that against the monster. But since it was a gamble with slim chances of victory, he could use his trump card. The demon-slaying blade has the characteristics of both a plant and a sword, growing its roots into the ground. It takes time to exchange energy and strengthen it enough, but while the dragon's tears were falling, it was possible to increase the sword's power by using a technique that absorbs the rain and stores the energy of the subdued demon. Now the boy's sword was charged with lightning. Then Park Han-yeol charges toward the monster, landing a blow on the beast. Soon after, the monster's head gets stuck in a building. The protagonist takes the opportunity and cuts off its head. The people watching couldn't believe the boy had killed that thing. If someone had been killed by that bird, the authorities wouldn't have paid much attention. But that young man didn't hesitate to save someone in danger. They compared him to a superhero. People started recording videos of the boy. However, the protagonist is suddenly attacked. A man appears, asking if he knew what he had just done. Because he had killed the bird that Miss Yu cherished, and burning someone like him wouldn't be enough punishment. The video of the protagonist being attacked begins to go viral, and criticism starts to emerge. A woman asks if her child had died, and if that man had burned the insolent one who killed her messenger. Her assistant responds that for now the boy had been detained. Yu says it seemed like everyone despised her, as they were only keeping that impertinent boy in custody. She becomes furious, ordering that all humans be told that if they didn't want to suffer her wrath, they should set an example and kill the boy. But her assistant responds that there was a report indicating that the protagonist's actions had become a trending topic. Therefore, the woman should be kind to the boy, as there was a great level of dissatisfaction with the new leadership. Yu says the rules of that world weren't fun, and the government's rules were frightening. She was sure Vemi had some way to calm her down, and the maid in turn responds that she had prepared a tribute to ensure Miss Yu's reputation wouldn't be tarnished. Yu then says she will wait for it. Soon after, the rain begins to stop, and the woman says the Dragon King had relieved his sorrow. It was just an illusion that transcendent beings were free from desire. Miss Yu grabs a package, and thinks that the important thing was that she managed to obtain it. It was a piece of trunk. That fruit is called the treasure of fantasy, even by the gods, and its flowers only bloom once every 3,000 years. It's a mystical tree that only grows in the orchard of the Queen Mother of the West, the peaches of the Tree of Immortality. Yu mentions that when the Queen Mother sacrificed herself to close the gates of heaven, the orchard disappeared, and if she could obtain a sprout from that bark, Her name would replace that of the Queen Mother of the West. Park Han-yul is walking down the street, remembering that a man had told him he had made all the deities look like bad people, and that from now on he shouldn't do anything that made him stand out. Then the protagonist looks at his H, and thinking that even though his sword had been confiscated, he was happy to have obtained that. That night, the boy had found a block of wood in the bird's body, and he wondered why that piece of wood had been stuck to the ankle of that monster. However, he realized that the trunk was alive. Soon after, that man appeared, and the protagonist managed to get a sprout before being attacked. So, he wondered if he should try to cultivate it. A year later, a news report says that the government has taken various measures to purify the water. A man complains about the smell. He says the water problem is because of a monster, and that the government should deal with it first. A month ago, when the celestial energy was in disarray, a monster hid in the Han River. A 1,000-year-old snakehead fish. After crossing the world of monsters into a river in the human world, it became powerful enough to claim the title of God. Calling itself the sovereign of the Han River, the creature declared that no one could use the river's waters until a human sacrifice was fulfilled. A boy watching a report says that fish seem to have a worm's brain. That was Yang Giju, a disciple from one of the 8 sacred mountains on the Korean peninsula. Then someone tells the boy to avoid making unrelated comments during that meeting, and that it would be better to behave and sit properly. That was Shin Soman, the youngest disciple of one of the 8 sacred mountains on the Korean peninsula. However, the boy didn't care about that meeting, because it wasn't a problem they could discuss and solve alone, and that in the first place, everything was based on the immense will of the elders. But Wona becomes irritated, and asks if that's what his master taught him. She says 10,000 people have already contracted diseases because of the water, so they should find a solution as soon as possible. Then she asks how the boy dared to insult her master. Yang Geju asks if the woman was capable of killing the sovereign of the Han River, because 4 of the best immortal mystics tried to stop the creature, but failed, and he questions if she wanted everyone to die at the hands of that fish. The difficulty in dealing with the sovereign of the Han River lies in its ability to use both earth and water techniques. Very few people have mastered 2 techniques like the sovereign, so the only way to defeat it is with an immortal, who masters earth to force it away, or someone with a high rank in earth and water energy. The boy says he won't stop Yang Giju from making his plans, but he won't participate. The woman becomes angry and breaks the presentation remote. Then the boy leaves to train. He says that if someone could defeat that fish, they would have the solution. The woman walks into a forest, carrying the demon-slaying sword, because she remembered that a year ago, a man killed Yui's-berg with that weapon. And although he was imprisoned and eventually released, the sword was confiscated and kept by the Immortal Society. It was a rare wooden tool, and since it was shaped like a sword, it brought much confusion to the heavens. But just as the energy that inhabited the weapon gradually disappeared, the confusion came to an end. Park Han-yul hadn't set foot outside Gwanak in the past year. Sometimes he went out to eat with his mother or friends and watch movies in his free time. The girl remembers that he had said he wasn't using any phone apps, so he wouldn't be able to calculate his achievements. Considering what Park Han-yul had been through, it wouldn't be impossible. Then the protagonist appears, and upon seeing the girl, he turns a corner. Yang Jaiju thinks she can't lose him and decides to follow him. However, she can't catch up with the boy, even running at full speed with the help of a talisman. As a result, she loses track of him. But Park Han-yul reappears, asking if she was affiliated with the Immortal Society, and says he had no intention of running away. He was just surprised that the girl was following him. The girl notices that the protagonist was sweating, and wonders why he only used physical strength and not a talisman to get rid of her. Then she throws a phone to him. The device has its user changed. After that, Park Han-yul shows his information. Yang Jiju discovers that he was still a high immortal, but ranked below her. Park asks if Yang wanted to use his wood element to kill the sovereign of the Ham River, wondering if the immortals really wanted that monster dead. That's how he saw things. Yang says no, because the reason her seniors hadn't taken action on that was that they wanted to see the juniors solve the problem without needing their help. The protagonist says that thousands of people were suffering because of it. Accepting the offer, Park asks if, by cooperating, he would be compensated, and if by any chance he could get his sword back. Yang asks how the boy knew about that. Park replies that by breathing he could interact with the trees around him, and that was the function of the technique he had learned. Yang thinks that's the reason Park could run so fast in the forest. Park then says he first wants to know if his curfew would be lifted as a reward. Yang replies that he was allowed to be rewarded, but attracting everyone's attention was a big problem, and besides, there was no one to promise him anything just because he had helped. Yang explains that the curfew was initially imposed by the superiors to punish Park for killing Miss Yua's bird, but now that incident could easily be resolved if she did everything to persuade that man, helping them get rid of the sovereign of the Han River. Sometime later, Park was already by the riverbank, and the other man asks why they needed to go to that place. He didn't know if Park had come to this place to try something, but it was the nuisance he had seen there because he wanted to see the creature. Yang asks him to calm down, as it was all because of the sovereign of the Han River. Wondering what the protagonist could do in that situation. Taking the album out of his backpack, he thinks it was disgusting. He had prepared it for this moment, but he hadn't expected to use it so soon. However, the woman warns the boy that it would be dangerous to get any closer, but she ends up surprised by what the boy was doing. Park asks if she hadn't seen this in elementary school, as he used to germinate plants in his class. That plant was very good for purifying water quality, and now it was halfway done, with just the rest remaining. At that moment, a giant creature emerges from the lake. The protagonist grabs his sword and gets ready, saying he was about to start fishing for that fish. A thunderous roar echoes through the area. The creature declares that it was the god of that river, therefore it wasn't someone who would be obedient to another. It attacks the protagonist, who barely manages to dodge. Soon after, he seems to start casting a spell, hurling at the creature. Furious, it asks how he dared to do such a thing. But at the same moment, it gets hit by several projectiles from the protagonist, leaving the monster even more enraged. Meanwhile, Yang is still protecting the other men. Thinking it was impressive, because by using the purifying plants, Park had completely drained all the dirty elements from the river sovereign. However, if he continued at that pace, he simply wouldn't be able to win the battle. The monster says that despite his ability to deal with hard-to-see energy, his petty tricks simply didn't work. Attacking the boy again, who, as a consequence, seems to start falling into the lake. However, he throws more of those seeds to support himself, mentioning that this was the last one he had. Throwing it at the monster, the creature says that it was the tree that was struck by lightning, asking if Park intended to destroy its body with that little toy. However, Park says that it was a toy he placed in her heart, asking if she couldn't feel it, and at that moment, he starts diving again, saying they would see each other again. Beginning to cast a spell, he says it was a thunderbolt and lightning dart he made himself. Therefore, he couldn't just let the creature leave. He starts electrocuting the entire area, successfully hitting the creature, and a huge explosion engulfs the area, successfully defeating the creature. The protagonist says that now the air was much fresher. Standing on top of the serpent, he says he had committed a bad act again, attracting attention once more, and didn't think it would end well this time. The reason the mortals had neglected the Han sovereign was really for the sake of trials and growth. So, all of this was for their disciples, not for normal people. Looking around, it seems he found what he was looking for, thinking it was smaller than expected. The inner core of water-based creatures, the reinforced crystals, were rebuilt in the hope of becoming a dragon. For that reason, he decides to take it as a reward for his mission. However, a man suddenly insults the protagonist, asking what he was doing. They quickly use magic to restrain him, asking if the boy knew what he had done. That man was the celestial king called Nakusha. The girl watching from above seems to recognize the man who was restraining the protagonist. Remembering the words of that other man to just act like everything was fine, until those ungrateful immortals found themselves in trouble and started complaining. Thinking that the fact they had appeared like this, and that the sovereign of the Han River had been subdued, meant they had altered the fate of the Han River's death. The girl then greeted the man, saying she didn't know how the seniors had come to that place, and the man questioned whether it was worth saying that the place was safe or authorized, asking if she wasn't the disciple of Tebek, to which she quickly responded that he was correct. The man questioned whether she was saying that a disciple of such a master didn't recognize the gravity of the situation, because that boy she had brought had trained for only 1 year without any master. Even though the wood construction technique is rare, a man who trained without a master for a year used a technique strong enough to defeat a sovereign, asking if she wasn't doubting that guy's identity and warning her that if she dared to open her mouth again, it would bring great humiliation to Tebek. Completely desperate, the girls seemed to understand the situation. The protagonist then began to laugh. The man asked if he had lost his fear, and Park asked why he would be desperate, wondering if he had done something wrong. Because they were doubting him just because he had a unique ability. But unfortunately, this was the second time it happened, so he was already checking the app. However, it was only 3 minutes after the fish had died that they all appeared. Everyone around seemed confused by what the boy had said. Park said they should have been watching that fish closely, and judging by how they appeared right after its death, asking if they thought that if they had killed that fish, it would be well regarded by the public. And since they ruin everything they could have used to grow, they came running to that place in desperation. The boy, now completely irritated, told them to stop. Soon after, an explosion happened, claiming that it was the protagonist who caused it. However, he ended up surprised, because his attack had no effect. Park said he always aimed for the stomach, just like before, and then he pointed a sword at the man, who became completely enraged, asking if Park knew what it meant to point a sword at him, and if he had any last words before he died. However, to Park it wasn't as if he would die, because the man wouldn't be able to kill him. About to attack the protagonist, the man said that his arrogance reached the heavens, unleashing an attack on the protagonist. Then, a massive explosion occurred and the man seemed surprised, because someone else had arrived to interrupt the fight, saying that the watchman should guard the garden, questioning what he wanted in that place. The name of that man was Boki, a high-level immortal from the 3 realms of heaven. Boki said he had a request for his lady. He hoped he hadn't interrupted their display of power, but this was just unjustified violence, and now, from what he saw, that boy was quite foolish. However, if they wanted to fight, he wouldn't stop them, because both would have a bad reputation. But the boy had no justification, so please, they shouldn't get in the elder's way, and soon after, the two disappeared. Then the man asked why that lady had to call Elder Beck to save the protagonist. Sometime later, the young man seemed to be walking somewhere with Beck, asking if the young man knew he would appear, and if that was why he had been so bold, mentioning that you would give him some advice, saying that he might think he was special, but uncommon arrogance leads to ruin. Hearing what the man had said, the protagonist remained silent, saying that he would keep that in mind, thanking the elder for his advice. Thus, 1.5 years had passed since that day, and he still remembered how confused he was with all the setbacks he had that day. No matter how good his intentions were, they weren't well received by everyone. Therefore, he had prepared carefully since the story of the Han River Sovereign began to unfold. For that reason, he wouldn't have to go through that again, and he wouldn't act without knowing things, nor would he be treated as a fool. He wouldn't be the victim as he was that time. Miss Yuwa has a garden. Not just any garden, but one where divine medicinal herb is carefully selected and cultivated. But the story about that garden could have just been a rumor. So, he devised a plan to seize solid evidence. A plan to attract the attention of the lady who had the garden. That's why now he was prepared, standing in front of her. Yuwa asks if he had mentioned his name was Park, and then questions if the young man knew what those were. The boy responds that they were seeds of the purgatory grass. The woman says that such a precious thing had been discovered by mortals repressing it on the black market. She had investigated the seller to punish him severely. Sensing the gravity of the situation, the protagonist kneels, admitting that he had sinned gravely. He explains that he had no choice, as his living conditions were very poor. However, the woman asks him to lift his head, saying that it was all fine now as he had paid for his sins, but she only showed mercy so the punishment would be balanced, because the price for killing her bird wasn't light. Yet, she would show mercy once again. She then asks why he didn't work in her garden, because she personally had a garden that cultivated grasses and herbs, and if the boy was capable of cultivating purgatory grass, he certainly had enough skill to cultivate common aquatic plants that had purified the poison of the sovereign in the Han River. Park thanks her, saying she thought so highly of him. But the reason behind his plant cultivation was all due to the technique he had learned. But Yuwa says that using that technique it should take only a day or two for common plants to start bearing fruit. However, Park replies that the purgatory grass hadn't grown more than a sprout. And no matter how much time or effort he dedicated to it, it wouldn't grow any further. The woman then asks if he's saying he lacks dexterity, and the protagonist admits that this is true. The woman then comments that he had more courage than it appeared, and couldn't believe what he was negotiating with her. She mentions that she would support him with some divine medicinal herbs from her garden for proper tools. In addition, she would accompany him to help him become enlightened. For that reason, she would assign another young man to assist him. Kneeling again, the protagonist thanks her for her mercy. However, this had always been part of his plan. Giving a signal to the other girl, Yuwa asks if she had been in that place all along. The girl quickly approaches her master. The one asks what her verdict is, and the girl mentions that Park seemed very suspicious. Because he was being so cordial, it looked as if he were plotting something. Moreover, she had heard that he was the one who killed her bird, and even defeated the sovereign of the Han River. The boy wasn't experienced. But for him to achieve so much could only mean he was either a genius or truly an idiot. The girl asks if her master knew he had been scheming from the start, but still accepted him. That was why her master had asked her to keep an eye on him. However, the woman tells her not to worry so much, as she would let him manage the 6th garden first, and even if he had bad intentions, he wouldn't be able to obtain even a single seed from her garden, and if the boy turned out to be useless, it could turn him into fertilizer for her garden. The girl thinks they had decided to work together because of the peninsula peach, but Yuwa was a lady she couldn't quite like. Even so, she hoped the protagonist would be more useful. Meanwhile, Park is walking down the street, thinking that the power of the immortal hidden in that place was over 300 and Yuwa's power exceeded 400. Park had reached 10 stars in the Star Wind technique over the past year, so he could roughly gauge others' power, but he didn't fully trust those numbers. The Celestial King and that temperamental man were above 600. Additionally, Beck had a power level exceeding 400. The protagonist, on the other hand, had about 45. He thought about how he had learned all the Star Wind techniques during the past year, but they were only theoretical. For that reason, he still had much more work to do. Arriving at his destination, he thinks he's finally where he needed to be, and at that moment he stumbles upon a glowing sacred tree. He says that today he brought something for the tree, and it was the centimony from the sovereign of the Han River. Since he was giving one to the tree, he should also receive one in return. Sometime later, the young man seems to be meditating in front of the tree. When suddenly he wakes up, surprised because the smell of those peaches was so good. He managed to improve his attack power just by sitting in front of it. The breathing peach had been training its form for the past year, but it was only in this last week that the flowers of this tree had bloomed and bore several fruits. Even so, they were still quite small. However, as they had grown and matured, at least now he could eat a bit. Right after, a voice tells the boy not to be so hasty. Looking to the side, Park seems surprised. A small bear had started talking to him. Park, in turn, asked if he could know who he was. The bear then says that the elder had named him Guanaki. So, Park asks if he was the mountain god known as Wanuskan. Thinking that after the gates of heaven opened, the deities began to reveal their existence, and this one, in particular, had been quite unlucky. Hundreds of years ago, when the capital was moved to Hongguang, the land officials believed that the fire energy from Mount Guanaskin effectively affected Hinawan. By adding water energy using the mythical statue of the unicorn lion, along with the excavation of the Blue Lagoon, among other things, they constantly awakened the energy of Mount Wanuskan. That's why this bear was only half his height. Park mentions that he had been training in that place for over a year, so he thought he would have already met him. However, he had only encountered him at that moment. The bear explains that it was because he didn't see any reason to interfere with a devotee who was training. Park wonders if the bear's goal might be the peach. But since the tree had distorted the area, he couldn't enter the barrier. He asked the bear to wait a bit because he just had to eat something. However, the bear again asks him not to do that, asking if he hadn't heard what he just said because it would be very reckless. The tree's energy is centered in the fruit, and if he took it now, the tree's protection wouldn't work at all, asking what the boy would do if the people who were watching the tree took it. Park gasps if the bear was going to steal the tree and the bear, if he looked like a thief. But it wasn't just him. Sooner or later, some people would notice the existence of that place, and right now, there's someone at the end of the hill waiting for the protagonist. Looking up, Park notices the giant bear ear, supposing that it was a tremendous energy. Pointing his finger upward, the bear says he had warned him before, and if they were attacking the barrier so much, it could mean they were determined to get him there. Or perhaps they were after the peach from the tree of immortality that was growing. Park says that maybe it's the peach mentioned in the journey to the west, the one the Monkey King eats, but the bear tells him to forget about that. The important thing is that one of the top Taoists was after him, someone using fire techniques. With his training, the boy was able to traverse forms of the tree. A mere human body cannot digest the effects of the peach of immortality. However, the bear was different, and that's why he should give the fruit to him. Only then would he regain his spiritual energy to protect him and the tree from that man. However, Park apologizes again and begins to eat the peach, leaving the bear completely shocked, wondering who this boy was. But still, that was the peach of immortality that had transformed the Monkey King into the strongest man. Wondering what would happen to the protagonist, and at the same moment, the system announces that the drug has been consumed. Park immediately sits down to meditate. The bear asks how he's feeling and if he's noticed any changes in his body. The young man responds that the peach was very sweet and fresh, leaving the bear speechless with what he had just heard, calling him an idiot. Park, in turn, thinks the bear really got worked up, but no matter what breathing technique he tried, he couldn't control the heat moving freely through his body. Although it wasn't anything like the heat that bothered him last time, this feeling was gentler. The bear explains that it takes 3,000 years to produce a low-level fruit, so one that grew in a year must be of very low quality. Park, for his part, says he's having trouble and asks if the bear could help him. The bear says he couldn't help even if he wanted to, because he didn't have the power for that. Right after, the protagonist throws a seed at the bear's forehead, leaving the bear completely irritated by what he had done. However, the bear then realizes what was thrown at him, asking if that wasn't a purgatory seed and if he was giving him something as precious as that. The protagonist then gently hands him several of those seeds, mentioning that at the moment, that's all he had. Asking if the bear would be able to recover with all of that, to which the bear quickly responds that it would be easy. Park, in turn, asks what he could do now. Then the bear replies that from now on, he could start selling caves. Park was left completely shocked by what he had heard. The bear told him that with just those 3 purgatory grass sprouts, it wouldn't be enough to restore his power. The protagonist asked if there was anything else he could do, and the bear asked if he had anything else up his sleeve besides that. Park then mentioned he could check something accessing the system, and said it had that function. Observing it, the bear noted it was the map of that area. Meanwhile, Park realized he'd have to deal with the person approaching. The bear asked if Park was thinking of fighting, and the protagonist confirmed it, saying that if he just left things as they were, his tree could be taken away. The bear thought it was obvious that Park would lose with his current power, and wondered what the boy could be thinking, seeing how calm he was. In that moment, the young man started running toward the approaching figure. The man thought he had finally found the protagonist. Soon after, Park was standing in front of him. Sensing the energy, the man asked if Park was a disciple of the Celestial King, and whether his master had ordered him to take Park back. Quickly, the young man replied that he was correct, and added that they had even given him an item, the 9-tailed fox fan. The bear exclaimed that the 9-tailed fox fan had only been seen once 300 years ago. He couldn't believe that such a treasure was created from the tail of a fox, as it was extremely rare. Being a treasure, the tail remained intact, and the phantom energy it contained must be truly formidable. The man confirmed that the fan indeed belonged to the 9-tailed fox. Park, however, asked even if it were the Celestial King's fan, "Will you really cause an explosion in a place filled with people?" The man then asked if Park couldn't feel the energy of the area, saying that no matter what skill he used or how much he screamed, the bear interjected, explaining that the man's unusual energy was due to the treasure he was using, which contained the power of 4 celestial beasts. The man, growing irritated, asked why the bear always interrupted him. However, Park didn't even know about that. Angry, the man said even that small creature was interfering, asking why the bear was always getting involved in his affairs, and instead of taking the life of the fish, he would take Park's life. Watching the situation unfold, Park thought that his power had momentarily reached close to 105 times stronger than his initial power with that sacred item. It felt like an item from a fantasy game purchased with money. So, if a shit arrived, he spread his energy across the mountain, lowering his abilities. Park didn't believe he was truly gathering energy. Realizing the situation, the protagonist started using one of his skills called wind distribution, thinking that he was gathering the energy he had distributed. In a matter of seconds, the man launched an attack at the protagonist, which Park simply shattered. The bear was left speechless by what he had witnessed, wondering if such martial arts techniques were even possible. Park asked if he had mentioned before that no matter what happened, nothing would leave that place. Because if someone was trying to brandish their weapon against another, they had to be prepared to face a counterattack. The man, shocked, asked how a bastard without proper teachings could dare challenge him. But at that moment, something strange started happening. A blue glow began to surround the boy, and immediately, the young man collapsed, unconscious, onto the ground. Park approached to check if the young man was okay, saying that when he recklessly wielded the fan, hoping to obtain power greater than his own, his soul was absorbed into it. However, Park didn't fully believe that was the case. The bear commented that if the right person had achieved this, the entire mountain would have blown up. Park wondered if a sacred item was truly that powerful, and if it was, he needed that item. Suddenly, an explosion erupted. It seemed the man from earlier was attacking the barrier. Grabbing his disciple, the man said it was an unbelievable mistake. He couldn't believe that a disciple of the Celestial King had become a fool in his domain. And it was clear that the child would not be able to escape the wrath of the Celestial King again. Even if he were the commander of the Immortal Society, or a master of the Red Martial Arts, it was nothing compared to the 8 sacred monks. Park in turn said that he had done everything purely in self-defense. Park thought that self-defense also applied to the man attacking him, and he began to prepare his counter-attack. Irritated, the elder said he should have burned Park a year ago. He couldn't understand why the Celestial King wanted a walking disaster like him. But now that it had come to this, he would burn Park completely, leaving only his bones behind. Yet the protagonist coldly observed the situation, without any reaction. In a matter of seconds, Park began to run. The man continued to pursue him relentlessly, casting multiple spells at the boy. Feeling cornered, Park admitted he was at a disadvantage. He felt that his compatibility with the situation didn't seem favorable. Out of all the elements, fire was the least suited for him. The bear urged him to use the 9-tailed fox fan quickly. By just inserting energy into it and wielding it, the bear explained it should work no matter the element used. But then, the elder cast a spell that struck the poor bear. Meanwhile, the protagonist pondered the bear's idea, wondering if his soul would be sucked in just like the other boys. Still, with no other option, he decided to try anyway. He began casting his spell with the fan's ability. Irritated, the elder shouted, asking how Park dared to use the 9-tailed fox fan. But all the attacks ended up hitting the elder instead, leaving Park completely stunned by what he was witnessing. This was truly the power of a sacred item. He wondered where the man had gone. At that very moment, Park was struck from behind. He suffered a severe wound, suspecting that one of his organs had been injured. Rising amidst the flames, the elder said it was pathetic. Not only had Park turned the Celestial King's disciple into a fool, now he was using the 9-tailed fox fan. Park couldn't believe he had survived. He questioned how so-called immortals could be like this. The elder started casting multiple spells at Park, declaring that this would be his end. The spells hit the poor boy, dealing him a fatal blow. The elder mentioned that he wouldn't let Park use those dirty tricks again. And so, he would take him to the Celestial King. The young man, overwhelmed, wondered if this was the moment he would die. He supposed that if his body had been fully restored, he could have won. However, he was confused as to why the pain had suddenly vanished. Then, a peach began to float in the air. The system announced that the drug analysis was complete. A long time ago, the Monkey King sought freedom from interference and so, he obtained his skin. He wasn't harmed by the many sacred items wielded by the celestial realm. He endured 49 days on the eightfold celestial path, even under the pressure of Buddha's 5 fingers. His skin lasted approximately 500 years. Thus, Dong sought a body invulnerable to death. He managed to acquire cells that even the cruelest death arts performed by the envoys of the land of the dead couldn't harm. Eventually, even the king of the underworld gave up on killing him. The system announced again that the drug had been consumed, and the properties of the drug were from the peach. Its function was to create custom devices optimized for an element, and this is how Park gained the power he had desired. The device was responsible for various metabolic actions, including neutralizing poisons. Park's new liver filled his body from head to toe with cold water. Opening his eyes, the protagonist appeared completely different from before. The elder, apparently noticing the transformation, wondered how Park had acquired water energy. Then he realized he had made a grave mistake. Park, it turned out, was an irregular. Park himself didn't understand how it had happened. But for now, he was just glad he wasn't feeling hot anymore. He picked up the 9-tailed fox fan again. Launching another attack at the elder, the man, completely in disbelief, was struck by the attack and thus the battle ended. Park collapsed to the ground, unconscious, while the bear frantically urged him to open his eyes. As Park slowly regained consciousness, the bear asked that he was back to his senses. The bear remarked that he didn't want to discuss what had happened, questioning if Park should leave the place filled with water. Park, still confused, looked around. He realized that the entire area was submerged in water. He couldn't comprehend what was going on. Checking the elder's body, Park muttered that he had heard about a flag that acted as a remote control for the barrier, wondering where it was. Observing the situation, Park seemed surprised. He then found a kind of red talisman. The bear, on the other hand, and said that it was a treasure pouch. In summary, it was a magical bag created to store small and large items. However, the bear reminded Park that this was no time to be playing around, as he bet there were several people heading toward their location. As Park carried the man on his back, the bear asked where on earth he was going. Realizing he had dropped the man on the ground, the bear questioned what Park was thinking. The bear warned that if they stayed there, others might discover the location of the tree. Starting to cast a spell, Park calmly asked the bear to relax. Using his magic, Park seemed to be planning something to deceive their pursuers. The bear was astonished by what he was witnessing. He thought Park was absorbing the upper Toi's body into the tree to germinate a new bloom of fruit. Park commented that luckily, they weren't too late. Noticing more people approaching, he remarked that they had completed the task just in time. The bear explained that the peach tree had blossomed, opening its barrier, which was why they hadn't been found yet. However, the bear grumbled that it was a shame since, if the Taoist hadn't been of the fire element, another fruit couldn't have grown from the tree. Taking advantage of the discussion about the fruit, Park asked if it had any special medicinal effects, but the bear responded that he didn't know. Being such a precious treasure, only a few people had knowledge of its true nature. Since nothing had changed in Park, the bear speculated that perhaps the fruit wasn't fully matured, which was why it hadn't had any effect yet. Park thought that if he could truly enhance his power through his liver, his water energy could increase. There was much to consider about that, and he wondered what would happen if he ate a fruit that had been cultivated for a long time. Meanwhile, the bear seemed to want to ask something, inquiring if the boy could show him what the outside world was like. Park questioned if it was possible for a deity to leave its mountain, and the bear explained that he just needed to share his alter ego. However, the bear needed power to do that, and Park thought the bear would cling to him like gum. The bear, however, said he had no other way to implode and follow Park. Now that their paths had crossed, the bear said he could see the world and all the good things through him. Observing the situation, Park seemed to accept the bear's offer. But in return, he demanded something that the bear had. Without hesitation, the bear handed over a weapon to the young man. As Park examined it, the bear began to explain that for a long time, including across the Korean peninsula, there had been a presence that appeared throughout East Asia. This presence was a fantasy race with intellectual abilities called goblins. Not only did they possess excellent basic skills, but they also had a spiritual physique. Their nature was remarkable, as they had exclusive weapons that refined their abilities. These were the goblins' helmet and club. As Park continued examining the weapon, he asked if he could use it, as he thought the book said only the original owner could wield it. The bearer confirmed this was true, but added that it was an important treasure that could be exchanged with a goblin for anything. The helmet and the club were not items that could be crafted twice. Losing either one meant the owner lost half of their power. Park remarked that if the bear still had it, it meant he didn't even know who the original owner was. From what the bear had said, Park thought it didn't sound bad. Accepting the club, Park said they would start traveling together, making the bear happy. Park then said that now they should focus on working for the lady of the garden. But before that, you would collect the special items from the unconscious people around. Meanwhile, with the upcoming Hibuji 22 summit scheduled for the 31st of that month, the government had made special plans to meet privately with the heads of high-ranking states. A man mentioned that he had heard the summit's reason was related to something called the Tower of Marbling. However, Park corrected the man, saying it was called Babel. The Tower of Babel was an unprecedented structure built by ancient humans to reach the heavens. Although it differed slightly from a myth of the past, the Tower of Babel had existed long before the gates of heaven were closed, and in the current dynasty of the Immortals, it was to be rebuilt according to Babylon's design. However, if the tower were rebuilt through this project, all the world's languages could be disrupted. It was clear that this would have its advantages, but the consequences would also be significant. For one, many businesses were built around translations. Park thought to himself that this was another global story unrelated to him, concluding that this world had nothing to do with him. In an instant, an accident occurred. Quickly, Park got up, questioning what had just happened. However, he was surprised by what he saw. The girl from before was standing in front of the car, ordering him to get out of there. She introduced herself as Jack Shambi, and mentioned that she had been asked to help him for the moment. However, If he involved her in any stupidity, he would regret it. The boy, in turn, promised he would be careful not to do that. Shortly after, the bear, now transformed into part of his phone case, muttered the name of the girl again. Whispering that the protagonist was in for a rough time, Park asked if the bear knew the girl, and the bear replied that he knew her just a little. The bear then asked if Park wanted to know her weaknesses. He explained that the girl simply adored handsome men, leaving Park completely confused by what he had heard. A long time ago, on Jeju Isle and Mong Dorian, the son of the deity called Mun, was famous for his beauty. Jak Seungbi, however, was an ordinary girl. She encountered the man while he was bathing, and as a result, her spiritual physique awakened, despite the gates of heaven being closed. Returning to the present, Park couldn't believe that story. It seemed too impossible. The bearer remarked that sometimes people awaken when their body and mind experience a great shock. These individuals were chosen and nurtured by deities in the human world. Since Jak Xiaomi had the same celestial physique of the Mun family, the other man had accepted her offer. Thus, Jak Xiaomi pursued that young man. However, it was clear that Mun did not recognize the girl. Who was an immortal without a patron? The girl, completely furious, questioned why she wouldn't have reasons to be acknowledged, and for that reason, she vowed to give Mun enough reasons to notice her. In less than 100 years, Jak Xiaomi had conquered Jeju Island. She became known as the chosen flower, who would reach the heavens and sweep across the world. After establishing a dynasty, Jak Xiaomi formally proposed marriage to Mun. However, her father, fearing the girl's power, devised a way to banish her. As she prepared for the wedding, dreaming of a happy future, she was betrayed. On the day of the wedding, a conspiracy unfolded against her. Assassins came to kill a poor girl, not her beloved, but murderers armed and ready. Enraged, the beautiful woman destroyed everyone who conspired against her. Even though they used the deadly Sura flower of extinction technique, they couldn't escape. Thus, the battle of that day became known as the Great Battle that almost sank the island. But in the end, she was the only one who lost. For that day, she had been betrayed by her own love. Aiming to use her abilities, some regents tried to approach. They sent young handsome men as the rumors said she liked that. But none of them could escape death. The bear asked Park if he didn't feel relieved considering the girl had no reason to hate him, because after all, the protagonist wasn't exactly handsome. This irritated Park, who asked if the bear wanted to be sent back to the mountain. Shortly after, the girl asked what Park was doing. They had already arrived at their destination. Climbing the stairs, Park apologized for the earlier incident. The Warren explained that there were 6 gardens in the castle, each numbered from 1 to 6. Among them, the only place Park could stay was the 6th garden. Park assumed the 6th was the worst of them, and didn't expect to have access to precious medicinal herbs right away. But even so, he was shocked by what he saw. He couldn't believe there were 2 suns in that place. He questioned why such a place was so miserable. The Warren explained that each gate had a different space-time, a different realm within that world. From now on, the protagonist would be the lord of that place responsible for cultivating crops. Park asked who the previous leader of the place was, and the girl questioned if he really thought there had been one. The place had been closed since the death of the last lord 100 years ago. The young man thought that as the world changed and the number of mortals increased, the value of herbs rose due to the increased demand. The girl mentioned that just because Park was in that place didn't mean he wouldn't be well paid. When harvest time approached, he could make a lot of money, especially since there were no other gardeners. Shortly after the girl bid him farewell, Park's phone suddenly started ringing, causing him to drop it on the ground. As a result, his phone's wallpaper became visible. In that moment, a flashback of what the bear had said earlier flooded Park's mind. He quickly muttered that he respected the girl. Sometime later, Park opened his eyes. Meanwhile, the bear was munching on something, remarking that Park had finally woken up. He noted that the boy had been out for nearly 2 hours. Park asked what had happened, and the bear replied that it was a clean hit. It was the first time he had seen someone perform such a move without using a technique. Even though the 6th garden was the worst among the others, only carefully selected seeds were cultivated there. The bear suggested Park should take advantage of that. Park reflected that the girl had said she would observe while the place was maintained until the next harvest. If he demonstrated some skill, he might be able to request the cultivation of more valuable plants. For example, the peaches he had eaten before. Or perhaps something even more precious. He considered using the 6th garden to further strengthen himself. Therefore, He wouldn't let Hanyun touch it or harm his family in this world of untamed mortals. But to achieve that, he first needed to do something about the wasteland before him. Looking around, he realized the place was a complete mess. Reaching into his backpack, he found that his belongings were completely burned, but he already knew that, having overused them in his last battle. He mentioned that his sword had saved his life countless times, thanking it for all it had done. The bear observed Park, astonished by how sincerely he prayed. It was just a plant, but it could light up the sky without regret. At that moment, the sword transformed into a giant tree. Its roots began to envelope the entire area. The bear shocked wonder how such a thing was possible. He thought the burned spirit would take at least a month to restore itself, but it happened so quickly. Meanwhile, Park ordered the other trees to rise. Using his ability, he summoned wooden monsters. He instructed them to handle the agricultural tasks. The group started analyzing the trees. The bear remarked that it was incredible. Park had summoned the living spirits of the trees, something even high-ranked immortals struggled to do. However, Park said he needed to rest now, having used a lot of energy. While Park entered the house, he marveled at how much larger it was than he had imagined. He sat down to meditate, thinking he needed to regain energy using his breathing techniques. He soon became completely focused, but suddenly, he stood up. He was certain he felt a plant responding to his breathing. He supposed it might be under the floor. So, he decided to use the remaining seeds to uncover whatever it was. He began digging into the ground, leaving the bear utterly surprised, asking what the boy was doing. In that moment, something appeared among the rubble. Suddenly, an explosion occurred. Park, shocked, analyzed what had been buried underground. He questioned what the red circle was. The bearer explained that it was a blood barrier, and whoever made it must have held immense, uncommon resentment. Park thought the pulse had been coming from beneath it. He wanted to break the circle. He began attacking the barrier. Then, to his astonishment, he uncovered a secret chamber beneath the ground. The chamber belonged to Park, the ward of the Sixth Garden, also known by his pseudonym. From then on, the next lord of this Sixth Garden would tell of the atrocities committed by the lady of the castle. One day, on his way home after partying with a friend, he accidentally wandered into a shrine, and a guardian deity there had been possessed by a ghost. At the time, unable to do much, a kind scholar passing by helped him. The scholar successfully exorcised the ghost from him. After doing so, the man mentioned that Park would soon be fine. However, if a ghost had lashed onto him, it meant his spiritual physique was awakening. That meant if he remained in there he would either be pursued by immortals or tormented by wandering spirits. But there was no need to worry, as the scholar knew of an immortal who could guide him. Following the scholar's advice, Park entered the pavilion of the lady of the castle. She said that if he cultivated his mortal sense and dedicated himself to practice, he could transcend. However, since he was born as immortal, it would be like trying to grasp a star in the night sky, and without making progress, that boy did work everywhere. Eventually, his debt kept increasing. At that point, he thought there was nothing more he could do about it. But that wasn't the case. When he was nearing 30, he met a child like him who came from the human world with their own spiritual physique awakened. The circumstances that brought that child there were so shocking to him. However, it was in the same way that the man had come to that place. He realized that he truly had been possessed by a ghost. And not because he had stepped into the temple of a tutelary deity, but because a scholar had placed ghosts on him to awaken his spiritual physique. Thus, that boy had merely been a pawn on his chessboard. After realizing that he understood that he couldn't live his whole life as a servant, so he bowed his head to Hanyun, who had mastered the earth art, and begged to be trained. However, even after gathering and learning all of that, his mortal body, which had no power, grew weak as he aged, and in that state, he was given a nickname. They called him Foxtail Grass. Whenever he bound due to his hard work, they said he looked like the grass that grew everywhere, and so, he received that pseudonym. When that happened, he truly thought of the end of his life as he felt utterly powerless. Then a miracle occurred. That lady rewarded him with gratitude for sacrificing so much. Thus, he was chosen to be the lord of the Sixth Garden. There was no way he couldn't feel moved by that. He vowed never to forget the lady's grace, and to fulfill his duties as the lord of the Sixth Garden until the day he died. From that day forward, he dedicated himself to mastering the earth dragon art of the Sixth Garden. As a result, his power grew day by day, and he finally reached the point where he was on the verge of becoming an immortal mystic. However, even though he achieved so much, his body had grown even weaker. Only then did he understand the secret of the earth dragon art. Its effect was excellent, but it was being absorbed by the medicinal herbs of the 6 gardens surrounding his body. Without realizing it, he had become a living fertilizer. He realized that his life wouldn't last much longer. Reading the book, Park was shocked, thinking that he had only seen such things on TV, and that immortals were really capable of doing that. He said that, although he had assumed as much, he had nothing in common with what had been described. The bearer said it was a common practice, as immortals use such acts as a way to maintain the immortal realm. Ednor, in part, wondered if that meant he could end up like that man, and if someone had the ability to break through the barrier that man had created with his blood. There was no doubt the person was capable and exceptional enough to burn down the cursed pavilion. For his juniors who were in the same situation as him, he should escape with the stolen treasure, risking his life to protect it. Park wondered if perhaps those things belonged to the people mentioned in that testament. As he looked through the contents, he realized they were mandrake seeds cultivated by people of color across the oceans. Picking up another object, Park asked what it was. The book didn't mention anything about it, and the bear responded that it was like a container where people and temples drew lots. Park was surprised, realizing that the beats he had been hearing weren't coming from the seed, but from that object. He wondered if he should use them to cultivate something. Suddenly, an explosion occurred. The object seemed to resist growing along with him. Picking up the object again, he asked what it was. He said it felt familiar, questioning whether it was a blade shaft. The bear then revealed that it was a sword. Meanwhile, the lady seemed to be analyzing something. She remarked that the man had indeed traveled to that place. Then a girl appeared. She said she knew it was rude, but insisted they act first because it was an urgent matter. She mentioned that she had heard Manhwa had a treasure in her main palace. That's why she wanted it to be returned. The 7-branched sword was a very strange item, and it was valuable even in the place where the sword was made. That place originally was a country that couldn't establish itself. This was because among the 3 kingdoms, only Boksh didn't have enough power to support the creation of a nation. The city of Silla was the first to be created by a man who possessed an irregular physique, and the city of Gugurio was created by a saint to summon the previous lady with the blessings of the ancestral spirits of the Korean peninsula. However, King Unju ended up raising that man through human power without any supernatural ability or past. He eventually awakened his mundane physique and belatedly acquired the gold element. Thus, a master in martial art, learning to manage his energy on his own, and though King Unju was human, he was a rare genius. That man was at his peak due to King Unju's abilities, but over time, due to the lack of skill and subsequent kings, Beach eventually declined. Even the traces of its existence faded over the years, but one thing remained standing. He was compared to the genius King Unju, a saint prince who extended Bichu's power to the continent and the archipelago. Moreover, the 7-branched sword was a masterpiece created by the saint prince, a precious item that could be ranked among the great sacred artifacts. Returning to the present, the woman asked if they had received the blade before, and the girl responded that was all they knew so far. In the past, there was a record that when the king was about to present the sword to the celestial king, a messenger carrying the sword died of natural causes. However, fortunately, the ship carrying the sword was recovered safely, though the blade was never delivered to its country. The lady, in turn, questioned whether the girl was implying that the 7-branched sword possessed some kind of axis. She mentioned that it was very strange, as it seemed she had realized the existence of an axis a long time ago. She wondered why the girl was inquiring about it only now, but the girl replied that she had not come to ask meaningless questions. In the name of the sanctuary, she was there to propose a celestial lease for a period of 6 months. Understanding the situation, the lady of the garden asked what the conditions were. The other woman stated that they would wager the blade of the 7-branched sword in the middle of that battle. She requested that if they did not win, they would be allowed to take something from the lady's property, and if the axis of the 7-branched sword was found there, she promised not to take anything else. Shortly after, the lady of the garden accepted the offer, asking to add one more condition. After that event, 6 months had passed. A group of people was discussing the matter, as they were planning to broadcast the next celestial fight in real time. Moreover, the lady herself had said she would reveal it, and another man asked why they would broadcast it. While it was entertaining to watch, they were almost at the 6th garden. They should avoid causing discord with the lord of the 6th garden while approaching their progress, and refrain from making any trouble during the visit. Sometime later, the group arrived at the location. They were completely surprised by what was inside, since the place had once been desolate. Meanwhile, the protagonist in the background was eating while reading a book, noticing that the guests had arrived. The young man, in turn, seemed shocked by what the protagonist was doing. As he was relaxed and eating while observing them, he asked Park to at least show some respect in their presence. Quickly, Park stood up and greeted them, mentioning that his name was Park, the Lord of the Sixth Garden. The other boy introduced himself, saying his name was Lee, and he was there to report the garden's progress. Showing a system window on his phone, Park asked why his juniors insisted on calling him their senior. Realizing that the boy was a celestial immortal, everyone around was shocked. Then Park asked if a celestial fight was about to take place. They confirmed that this was what they had said, mentioning that even the Supreme Immortal, along with 2 players from each ranking, would be participating from the Japanese side. Park remarked that he hadn't heard of such an event, as he didn't go out often, and asked if the boy was going to circle around there. Lee quickly responded that things had turned out that way. The boy's name was Lee, and it was said that during the Korean War, he awakened his spiritual physique after the shock of losing his family in a bombing. Later, he joined the pavilion of the lady. Although he could be downgraded, he still possessed skills, and was a talented person who shone intensely after meeting a true master. Meanwhile, Park thought he couldn't trust most mortals, but that boy seemed different from all the others, as he had immediately apologized earlier for his servant's bad behavior. Parker marked that he couldn't believe he was going to participate in the celestial fight, and bet that he was the strongest immortal. The boy then said that although he was still weak, the lady had given him the opportunity to participate in that grand event. However, there were very strong contenders there, for example, one named Go, who was nearly a pure immortal, and was said to be related to the bloodline of the lady's son. He mentioned that he was lucky to be in a celestial fight against someone like him. Meanwhile, Park seemed to be analyzing that boy from earlier. The group associated with the lady seemed to be discussing something, mentioning that the sanctuary had accepted their proposal. The mortals supported them so much because they had killed some creatures, and if they played an active role in the matter of national pride, they would receive more donations and praise than that girl who had previously slain a creature. At that moment, another woman appeared to interrupt the conversation, mentioning that the Lord of the Sixth Garden had gone to meet her. However, the lady asked to keep him waiting, as they were having a family meeting. But the woman said that the protagonist had said something that had greatly angered her. Standing up, another boy became furious, questioning if that newcomer dared to challenge him. However, the lady said that in her view, it wasn't bad to deal with the protagonist. There was a rumor that he was staying in the celestial rank on purpose, because he was afraid to compete with others. So, if the boy didn't like that kind of rumor circulating, he should accept the challenge and show his best skills. Observing the situation, the lady of the garden said the woman was right, asking if he could defeat that boy. However, the young man seemed reluctant. Sometime later, the two were already in a duel, with the lady and several others watching the battle. Meanwhile, the boy glared at the protagonist, telling him not to blame him if he burned in agony. Surprised, Park thought that the young man was staring at him with murderous intent. At that moment, the judge announced that the battle could begin. Then the young man started throwing various spells at Park, and in defense, the protagonist used his magic. The other boy asked if Park thought he could stop his attack with just a shield of leaves, as that shield couldn't even hold its own petals. So, he would never let him have fun with that ability again, never. He began to summon a kind of magical meteor. With a threatening look, he declared that it was the end for Park. However, the protagonist seemed fearless, also preparing a spell, saying that it would be the opposite, he would be the one to kill the boy. In an instant, the two spells collided. But the protagonist's magic easily blocked the boy's, leaving him completely shocked, as the shield was absorbing his power. Then a giant explosion began to engulf the area. Suddenly, a man appeared in the middle of the battle, apologizing for his interference. Before the protagonist stood an unknown man, who said he couldn't let a child die, as he already knew who the winner was. However, the boy protested, saying he could still fight, and that the man shouldn't interfere in the battle. But the man replied that he was sure the victory belonged to the protagonist, and that he as his talents would never disgrace the pavilion. Observing the situation, the lady remained silent, stating that she accepted the outcome, as the man's words carried weight and the protagonist's talents were indeed valuable. Shortly after, the lady called for Park. Meanwhile, the boy was watching the man, wondering who he was. Sometime later, the lady was discussing with Park, asking what kind of training he had done over the past 6 months. Park replied that due to the nature of the earth element and the growing pace of martial arts, the training had been very fast. He knew the lady had brought him to cultivate something, and if she wanted, she could simply order him, as he was doing at that moment. He assured her she could trust him, as he didn't want to betray her. The lady remarked that his words were very bold, asking if he had been planning that from the beginning. She asked him to stay in the competition for now, as she would think of 2 places for him. As Park was about to leave, he mentioned that he had one last question to ask, questioning if he could leave for a while. Sometime later, Park seemed to be walking alongside the man from earlier. He thought that when the lady mentioned he would have a companion, he didn't expect it to be this man. Park then asked if he could know the man's name. The man replied that his name was Dan Deok, but Park could call him Rim if he wanted. Park thought that unlike the first time he had appeared, this man was indeed quite flexible. Looking to the side, Park asked if the man, by any chance, wanted to have a drink at that moment. Sometime later, the two seemed to be enjoying themselves while walking. The man said that even though he knew about such things, the situations in the human world were incomparable to the immortal realm. The protagonist was pleased, mentioning that he was happy because Ryan was enjoying himself. He remarked that he had heard that immortals sometimes visited the human world, asking if he had ever been there. The man responded that yes, when he died in the human world, he became an immortal with the help of the lady. However, he was devastated when he discovered that he would live in the immortal world, and not the human one. Observing the situation, Park thought that this man must have had many regrets in the human world, because he had achieved so much in life. Continuing, the man said he had once told the human world his name, and wanted everyone to remember him. At least after his death, but now thinking back, it was an unrealized dream from his immature days. While living in the immortal realm, he couldn't stop thinking about the things he lost. He deeply regretted what he hadn't done, but in the end, it was just a part of his past. Mentioning that it was a long speech, the man thanked Park for listening, and said that thanks to him, he could enjoy a tour of the human world once again. Meanwhile, in the background, a group of people seemed to be holding a sort of protest, demanding that the Dragon King stop the human sacrifices for that year. Observing the situation, Rang asked if Park understood what he was seeing. He said he couldn't believe that the country's leader was sacrificing his people. Furious, Rang declared they should go find the country's leader. However, the protagonist asked them to wait a moment because a sort of black circle was above them, supposing it could be a solar eclipse. But a threatening aura began to envelop the area and an explosion occurred. Desperate, many people started running for their lives. Amidst the darkness, a man remarked that those beings didn't know their place. Enraged, Park charged at the man, attacking him with a tool from earlier, seemingly defeating him. However, in the background, he heard voices pleading to be saved. At that moment, Park was struck by something and the person said they didn't expect to find him in a place like that, mentioning that the protagonist was wandering in the wrong world and for that reason, sensing the energy, Park said the man was an agent of Nakusha or something similar, thinking he recognized that energy and found it unpleasant, as the woman had felt it ever since the statue was destroyed. Additionally, the man was openly displaying his intention to kill. Park asked if he was perhaps close to the man he had just defeated. Then he said the man could say whatever he wanted because, no matter what happened, he would pay for the crimes he had committed in his life. Park, for his part, asked what crimes he had committed, and then he began casting his spell again, which enveloped the entire area, stating that the one who needed to pay for his crimes was him. Immediately, several wooden figures appeared, beginning to approach the man and defeating all of his henchmen. The woman, in turn, asked what they were doing, ordering them to release the phantoms right away, as they should tear the manlin from limb. Shortly after, the phantoms, also known as ghosts, were unleashed, moving toward the protagonist. Park thought that he hadn't expected to use this, but he was glad he had bought the short pipe at the market, and he immediately began consuming the drug. As a result, his strength and muscle endurance improved along with his concentration. At that moment, Park grabbed a kind of root, mentioning that he wouldn't miss them at all, and started executing them one by one. However, the woman said it didn't matter how many ghost trees resisted, as it was like poking a rock with a toothpick, demanding to know what her subordinates were doing and ordering them to release more phantoms to trap the protagonist once and for all. In a matter of seconds, blood started pouring from her mouth and meanwhile, all her subordinates fell to the ground. As they writhed in agony, they cried out for help from Hanyun. Park, surprised, observed the situation, asking if she really thought he was crazy enough to use a sword against her. Watching the smoke, the woman thought it could be what she was assuming. Then Park said that he used that drug to detoxify his body. But for everyone else, that smoke was extremely toxic, mentioning that this ability was quite terrifying. In her final words, the woman seemed to call out to her father. However, at that very moment, an explosion occurred and a man asked if the word she had uttered was father, while another man held the first man, asking if she was referring to that person. Observing that young man, the protagonist thought he was the celestial god Makusha. Shortly after, the man threw the other guy to the ground, who asked who were these people doing this to them, questioning if they knew who he was. However, the protagonist's friend said it didn't matter who he was because the point was that he had committed an unforgivable sin against the people. At that moment, the young man started laughing, saying he had been wondering what kind of nonsense they were talking about, asking them to remember that before going to hell, and thanks to his curiosity, he wouldn't let any mortal survive. Park thought he wasn't just absorbing the dead bodies, but also taking their strength. Wondering why they were using innocent people for such purposes. Mentioning that the man's art was extremely powerful, and he didn't know how he would be able to stop it. Wondering if perhaps he should use the nine-tailed fox fan. But he wasn't sure if it would work. Yet he had no other choice. The other man said it was an ancient art, and he couldn't believe the blood reincarnation was present in the human world, asking if the protagonist could perhaps lend him his sword. In the middle of that situation, the man seemed to be extremely focused. Then, shortly after, the protagonist handed him the weapon and he made a cut, managing to split that sphere in half. He said he had no right to punish him for his sins against innocent people, simply because he belonged to the immortal realm. However, the crime of taking the lives of other immortals and making sacrifices for his power was unforgivable, and for that reason, a member of the immortal realm should take responsibility and punish him, beginning to perform a series of cuts on the young man, who, in a matter of seconds, was killed. As a result of the mortal society's swift action, the terrorists were arrested and the terrorism suspects were from an organization called Rio Ablum. Meanwhile, that lady seemed to be watching the news. A man was giving his opinion on TV, mentioning that mortal society had done nothing and in the end, had only managed to film the scene. He said they just needed to watch that video because those two were their former heroes and the identities of the protagonist and his friend appeared on television. The presenter said that person was extremely familiar, asking if they remembered him, as he was the hero who had appeared a year and a half ago, the one who had decapitated the giant bird from before. Sometime later, that man was apologizing to his lady, mentioning that he wasn't qualified to belong to the immortal realm, and whatever punishment was given to him, he would not avoid it. The lady, in turn, asked Park if, after doing all of that, he still dared to look her in the eyes. Then, at that moment, the protagonist bowed, apologizing for the inconvenience, thinking that the girl didn't even seem angry. Then the lady asked the man to raise his head, saying she wouldn't claim that his actions were wrong, but rather, she was reprimanding him to be more cautious. She told Park to prepare for disciplinary action, and shortly after, she dismissed them both. Sometime later, Park seemed to have returned to his garden, feeling as though he had been away from it for days, saying that he could finally see it again, that he grabbed some notes, thinking that he hadn't expected to find what was hidden in the statue from before, mentioning that he didn't think it had any special power. Shortly after, the bear appeared on top of his head, asking if that wasn't Yi's handwriting. The protagonist asked if that family had done something wrong to the bear. A spirit, angry, said it was thanks to that family that he was in this form. Meanwhile, Park seemed to be analyzing the scroll, which didn't seem to have anything special about it. Thinking that, without a doubt, the one who wrote that was certainly King Sejong. In the writing it said that he knew he didn't have much time left to live, but even so he wasn't afraid of anything. However, the one thing he feared was seeing his son close his eyes before him, and the rest of his worries were about the people he would leave behind, seeing that Haiyang was losing weight day by day due to the curse of a deity. That's why he was concerned that after he and his friend died, someone protected by the immortals might seize power over the state, which could lead to that land being covered in the blood and tears of innocent people, because long ago many lives were lost because of the deities, and before that happened again, the era of immortals treating the human world as a mere plaything. Those who hadn't awakened their spiritual physique would also need power to confront the immortals. There was a distant war in the northwest and some letters called runes, and it was said that if all were combined, it would reveal their true power, and it functioned like a verse with power within the letters. Therefore, if someone could create a text with them, that could accomplish something incredible. Park said that perhaps he was trying to create a language system, similar to the Draco Bone script. The bear said that the cleverness of that child was famous, even in the immortal realm, and if he had lived another year, he would have achieved that. However, the protagonist quickly said that he believed the man had accomplished that feat. Continuing to read, the writing said that if Hanyul was good at reading and writing, then they should just learn how to activate it. That way, Hanyul could end up using the power of the letters, and his final wish was that those 28 characters would not disappear from the world, so that people could easily achieve their goals. Reading the content of that book, the boy was pleased, congratulating the person who was already dead, stating that the future the great king desired had become a reality. The boy used his abilities, and the wooden blocks began to levitate. The young man was amazed by his attack power, and that all of this was due to the power of words and sounds suited for instructing the people, as they had said, that if you could imagine the words in your mind, then you could use them just by reciting. Then the protagonist said the word burn, and the objects began to catch fire. Park Hanyul was amazed by what he was seeing, getting excited and continuing to burn the objects. That little bear appeared again, wondering who was making so much noise. Then startled, he asked why the young man was playing with fire in broad daylight. Jumping on the boy's head, asking how someone who couldn't even create fire without him had found a way to create it, and that the boy needed to be careful, so the fire wouldn't spread. Park Hanyul thought about how when he said the word louder, the fire grew stronger, or, if the louder he spoke the word, the more it would consume him. Then he fell silent to think about the matter, and concluded that if he could make a long and meaningful word, he could create something more powerful and effective. Park Hanyul took a deep breath and shouted, telling the sky to lament and cry as much as it wanted, continuing to shout the word sky multiple times. However, nothing happened. The boy, for his part, said that saying that out loud was a bit embarrassing, but then he noticed he wasn't alone. Some beat him smiled after witnessing the whole situation. Embarrassed, the protagonist asked how long she had been there watching, and the girl, for her part, started making jokes about his training. Then she said it was fine to do that, and that she respected it, and smiled at the young man, which made him even more embarrassed. After that, Park Hanyul asked why she had come there, and the girl replied that she had heard he was entering the celestial battle. Then she asked if the protagonist had beaten Cole, and commented that he was improving quickly, saying she had gone out a bit to prepare for the battle and found something for the boy, mentioning that she was supposed to be looking after him, but hadn't been doing so lately. But it seemed she didn't need to anymore. Then she tossed something to the boy. Park Hanyul, for his part, asked what it was, and the girl replied that it was a scripture, and they had asked her to deliver it since he had entered the celestial battle. The boy asked who had made it, and Sun Bainim said it had been a sage, the protagonist's father, leaving him completely shocked. Then he became irritated with the girl, asking where she had found this person who claimed to be his father. The girl replies that she had found him in a place called Shinfu. A long time ago, Huining descended from the heavens and gave moat root to a bear and a tiger who wished to become human. Unlike the tiger who fled, the bear endured eating the root and became the human Unmayo. Together, Huining and Unmayo gave birth to Dangan Wangyum and created a new history for Korea. That was the myth most people knew. However, what wasn't remembered within this myth was that Unio was not Hwanum's legitimate wife. Hwanum, along with his family, cultivated the sacred tree of life in a place in Koryo where the heavens connected with the earth, governing a place called Shinfu. Stumbainum says that the protagonist's father was married to Hwanum's youngest princess and resided in Shinfu. She explains that she had finished her work in Shinfu and was preparing to return when a man approached her, saying that her son was in debt to the palace and would soon be in trouble, so he had written something of vital importance. Not saying anything more after that, Park Hanyul thought his father had abandoned his family and simply fled somewhere. He had squandered the family's fortune for his own pleasure, and the burden of the accumulated debt was distributed to his mother and paternal grandmother. However, his father ignored all the blame, and in the end, his grandmother died for nothing. Park Hanyul grows serious, thinking that his father had found another family and that his previous family meant nothing to him. Then, Sambatim asks him to open the box, as it was truly a valuable item. When he opens the box, the protagonist finds a sealed mystical bamboo fan. The scripture, in the form of a fan, had been created to tame and seal demonic beasts and evil spirits. A fan with 24 blades is considered of high quality, but a fan with more than 48 blades is considered the best. Yet the fan the boy received had 72 blades, and he wondered why his father gave him something so valuable. The girl mentions that it was useful for absorbing evil spirits if he was interested in using it. Park Han-yul, for his part, says he would cherish it as he wouldn't find another way to get his hands on something so precious. Some Bain smiles, realizing he wasn't walking an easy path. 8 hours before the competition, the protagonist senses an aura and says it feels like someone is there. Then Daeok appears, walking. Surprised, Park Han-yul asks what he was doing there, and the young man says he came to make a request because he needed help crafting the Flute of Peace. It's known that the first appearance of the flute was during the unified Silla, but the object had been conceived and created long before. During the era of King Wanjido, there was a man whom even the immortals couldn't stop considering someone perfect. Because of this, the immortals lost their powers, allowing the Water Dragon King to cause a massive natural disaster, leading to the sacrifice of many humans. In search of a solution to respond to the disasters, the 3 kingdoms temporarily united. Thus, the masters of the kingdoms created a celestial item, the Food of Peace. However, the item was so powerful that they placed 2 restrictions on it. The first was that it could not be taken out of the Korean peninsula, and the second was that it could not be used in a way that would harm the people living there. DF mentions that the item was only used in Silla to defeat the mighty Water Dragon King, and then simply disappeared. He then says that he came to the protagonist because he probably knew what was needed to create one, and that's even because of the competition, the guards of the gardens would be reduced, so he planned to take the black jade bamboo from the second garden. But for the new fluid piece, they would need the black bamboo no matter what, and Lei Yua might become suspicious. As a consequence, there could be a new conflict with the Dragon Palace. Upon hearing this, Park Han-yul thinks that Daeok would likely take full responsibility, and that the reason he wanted to do this was probably because of the protests they had seen in Gwanghwamun. But he realizes that Daeok is different from the other immortals. Then he says he will help him. Because he also thought about the good of his people, and having someone like him willing to help was a good thing, and that it would be terrible of him not to want to help. The Yuk is happy, and says he was sure the boy would join him. He then says they should leave immediately. Upon arriving at the location, Park Han-yul discovers it is a floating island. His companion explains that it was an artificially created space by the pavilion, so if they alter the structure's formula, they'll be able to enter. But it wouldn't be easy. Daeok throws a small wooden horse figurine, which transforms into a beautiful black horse. Daeok asks the boy to hold his hand. As they ride through the skies, the young man says he won't let them touch the boy. This statement leaves him confused. However, looking back, he sees that they are being followed by flying sea monsters. Daeok drops the young man on the island, and says he'll distract them. He then rides off, but Park Han-yul realizes he'll also face problems there. Deciding to ingest the mandrake drug, he recalls that the proper sounds for the instruction of the people, the longer and more meaningful the sentence the better. He then shouts the word fast, and begins to run faster. He senses an unusual energy coming from 2 places, and thinks it would be great if one of them were from the Black Jade Lake. Suddenly, he is attacked by a lizard monster. But he dodges. Park is surprised, because the creature seems stronger than a celestial immortal. If it had a wood attribute, he'd be at a disadvantage. However, the boy says he has already taken his drug, so it would be hard for them to get past him. The creature is charged toward him. The protagonist shouts the word appear, and a brown bear appears. The lizards try to flee, but the bear continues to chase them. It tells the boy to keep waving his fan. The protagonist thinks it's no wonder he's called the god of the Fire Mountain. Among the great mountains, the evil spirits who command the mountains and have the word evil in their name are rare. And among all of them, there is only one that can control fire naturally. According to legend, people in the past believed that the mountain's fire would spread throughout Seoul, and to prevent that from happening, they created a lake around the mountain, suppressing the fire energy for years. The creatures flee, and the bear asks the boy to help him. Park Han-yul thinks it's strange that they are running right toward that energy. After all, it's probably the Jade Lake that's providing nutrients to this isle, and given how well the plants grow there. From the top of a tree, the boy sees the lizards fleeing toward a turtle-shaped structure. He wonders if that is the Black Jade Lake, but it seems to be just a stone. Then the little bear asks to be let down there. The boy responds that he's never seen anything like it before, and asks if the bear won't regret it later, to which the animal replies that it's curious. The boy then waves the fan, and the bear returns to be a massive brown bear. As it defeats the lizards, the beast remarks that they are very weak. But from inside the cave, something observes the bear. It then traps the bear in a water bubble, and the bear asks for the protagonist's help. He bursts the bubble using his abilities. Park Han-yeol comments that it must be the creature serving as fertilizer for the island. The little bear is surprised to see that there really is a creature inside. The protagonist wonders if the creature is a yum-hate. If a baby is this size, imagine it as an adult. He's also surprised that it's not a lake, but a divine beast trapped to feed someone's ego, and that the Leaf family. The bear comments that while it may be a baby, it's around 2,000 years old, and seeing it use that technique uncontrollably, it seems like it doesn't know the basics. While holding his fan, Park Han-yeol says it's good for the bear. Frightened, the small animal asks what he's talking about. The boy waves his fan, saying he'll give the bear a jar of honey later to make up for it. He then traps both creatures inside his fan. Inside the item, the creature fights with the brown bear. Park Han-yeol is pleased to see that both fit inside. He closes his fan, saying it's time to leave. While walking with Deok, a boy thanks him, as they manage to leave safely thanks to his help. The protagonist wonders why Deok seems so out of breath. He then notices that his companion is bleeding, but Deok tells him not to worry because he just needs to rest for a while to recover. Still, Park Han-yeol is concerned, knowing they will have to fight in a few hours. Defen hands something to the protagonist, explaining that it was a payment for helping him fulfill a difficult task. He elaborates that the item was crafted by twin dragons living in the Garden of Flowers, but that he wished he could give more of his own things. However, this was all he could manage to secure. The boy stays silent, observing the situation. Deok tells him not to look so solemn, as he deserves much more than just that. Park Han-yeol reflects on how his mission is far from over, since he still needs to create the Flute of Peace, and he thinks that perhaps a situation may arise where they won't be able to escape Yu's grasp. Then the young man helps Deok walk, suggesting they leave. Deok smiles, saying he knew the boy wouldn't be prideful. Both leave the place smiling. Park Han-yeol thinks that Deok is a strong person, both as a divine being and as a human. He promises to become strong enough one day to confidently call him brother. The people begin arriving for the competition. The announcer informs the crowd that they are in Dokdo, in the Eastern Ocean. The fight hasn't even started, but they can already feel the strong energy among the competitors. Next, it's explained that the competition will function similarly to previous ones, where there will only be one winner between two teams. Some are worried that this year's competition isn't balanced because the opponents come from different worlds. Park Han-yeol watches Deok, thinking about how he didn't even seem injured a few hours ago. Before the competition begins, representatives from each country send a message of greeting to the Water Dragon King, asking for his understanding as the competition will be held in his domain. Then some women prepare to transform part of the waters between the Korean peninsula and Japan. The two islands connect. This is the power of the sages. Thanks to them, the power of the water dragon has synchronized, creating a new space. The higher-ups chose the participants, and they were examined to meet the conditions set by each representative. A masked figure introduces herself as Siva, saying she will judge the competition with fairness and honor. Until a winner is decided, she promises to protect Yuwa with her life. A second masked figure appears, introducing himself as Odin, also stating that he will judge the competition with fairness and honor. He promises to protect the 7 branches with his life, until a victor is chosen. Suddenly, the protagonist's bag begins to glow. The boy thinks that the masked man must be carrying the sword that holds the power of the 7 branches, because it is reacting to the axis. The box containing the sword opens. The item seems to come to life. However, Odin contains it, apologizing, explaining that the sword has a competitive spirit and goes mad when it senses a worthy opponent. But it was strange for it to react this way, when the sword's owner doesn't even exist. Onan then apologizes for disrupting the competition. Yuwa comments that if the broken sword carries the divine power of the blacksmith, the man should know the level of that spirit. Park Han-yeol thinks the item must be the broken sword. It was named that way because the blade is so strong that it breaks any other. It's said that it was made from the bones of Valhalla's humans, which were strong and had significant combat power. The young man realizes that the sword's power must have been contained by the masked man. If he hadn't stopped it, the sword might have gone toward him due to its synchronization with his axis. The man must have sensed that someone there had enough power to make the sword react. Next, it is announced that Lee Young will be the first to participate. And he will face a celestial immortal. Someone sits next to the protagonist and says that it's a pity. The person is Gohan Hua. The boy asks, What's a pity? The girl replies that if he continues watching, he'll find out, as she hates explaining things. When the protagonist looks at the arena, Li Ang's opponent summons a kamikaze. The weasels charge at the boy, but he blocks the attack and tries to counter the celestial immortal. But before he could attempt anything, Kamidachi returned and managed to strike the boy, leaving the protagonist startled by what he was witnessing. Park Han-yul thought about how that celestial immortal had adapted and grown stronger within seconds. Go Han-ho smiled and asked if the young man understood, remarking that he was probably wondering how the opponent was winning without using any weapons. However, even if he didn't win, the boy should at least consider that on the other side, energy itself was also a weapon. This competition also served as a demonstration of the difference between Korean and Japanese abilities, and even the royal family was watching. The secret purpose of the competition was to create a performance that would stay in their memory. It was an opportunity to regain the dignity of the Go family and showcase it to the world. You were one to show the world an image of Koreans defeating the Japanese. At first, Lee Ung was just another piece. However, the boy managed to stand up after the kamikaze's attacks. Lee Ung had taken severe damage from his opponent's attack. His physical condition was deteriorating rapidly as the wound inflicted by the kamikaze caused him to bleed profusely. This prompted the tournament's narrator to question whether the Koreans would lose in the very first match. Then Lee Yuen attempted a counterattack, but before he could do anything, he was once again easily struck by the weasels. As a result, the boy was left even more injured and collapsed to the ground, unable to stand any longer. The narrator then announced that the first match ended in a victory for the Japanese. Go Haeyeon-ho turned to Park Han-yul, asking if he shouldn't be happy since, thanks to the young man, the Japanese wouldn't have high expectations. She then confidently stated that the boy could win his battle. She explained that they had to be the best in order to stand out. Park Han-yul stood up and said he would do his best, adding that he was sure he would win. As he entered the arena, the announcer pointed out that the boy had become famous due to Yuwa and the incident at Gwanghwamun. The same celestial immortal who defeated Lee Ung sneered, saying that another fool was coming his way, remarking how weak these people were. And however, Park Han-yul quickly dashed for the young man, delivering a punch to his face. Everyone watching the fight was stunned by what they had just witnessed. Park Han-yul had defeated his Japanese opponent with a single blow. Some banners shouted for him to be careful, warning that charging in like that could be dangerous. Deok, however, said that, in his opinion, the young man's move was clean and efficient. The girl questioned whether efficiency meant throwing oneself at the enemy without any defense. How could that be considered a battle technique? But Deep responded that it was indeed a technique, because that's how the protagonist had learned to fight. Park Han-yul consumed one of his drugs, gaining a vitality boost in his cells and increasing blood production in his body. Boy thought that using it would make him more resilient, but it would be better if he had used something with a hemostatic agent. Another Japanese opponent then entered the ring. Park Han-yul glared at her with a murderous look, which made the girl nervous. Yet she stated that she wouldn't go easy on him. She then summoned giant samurai statues. The boy figured that his opponent was using those to avoid close combat. He clenched his fist. Seeing this, the girl thought he would use the same punch as before, but she was prepared for that. However, one of her statues was grabbed by a wooden giant. The girl realized that the boy could also summon a familiar. The protagonist then declared that he would handle this the Korean way. He decided to use the ability to the sounds of power and began with a military sound. He sang a Korean military song. The people wondered why he was singing that. Park Han-yul recited a verse from the song, which urged them not to fear retreating and to face the enemy, stating that the country's fate was in their hands. After hearing that, the wooden giants attacked one of the samurais. The girl tried to stop it, but the giant's head was crushed. Park Han-yul smiled, pleased that his plan had worked. Everyone around was amazed by what they had seen, as Park had won 2 matches in a row. The boy reflected that in a fight, you couldn't reveal all his abilities. Otherwise, the next opponent would be aware of his fighting style. Besides, this competition was merely a show to entertain the Yuwa family and others. Leith ended up with a humiliating role, sacrificing himself like that, but still, he had no intention of playing around there. Because he would be the main character of that show. The announcer mentioned that 2 Japanese immortal-level opponents had already been defeated, and now there was a match against a pure immortal opponent, so they should see if Park could win again. Observing the man on the battlefield, people speculated that he could be a shinobi. Park, on the other hand, thought that the man's aura was certainly different from that of a celestial immortal, assuming that this was indeed a pure immortal. Quickly, the man threw some cunnies at the protagonist, who swiftly summoned his wooden dolls to defend himself. Then, an explosion happened, and once again that man attacked the boy, who barely managed to dodge the attack. However, those cunnies exploded again, throwing the boy into the air. The man about to strike again was met by Park, casting a spell to avoid the attack, saying that the man had almost sliced him in half. Because of that, he needed to respond with much more strength than casting a spell of the shinobi. Irritated, the bear said that the protagonist had left him alone with the man. But Park only smiled. He asked who that shinobi was and why he wanted to face the boy, but the protagonist said he'd explain the details later. Looking at the man's clothes, he noticed that he bore the crest of the Suzuki clan, and few people wore the pride of the three-legged crow. For that reason, the bear said he would take out his anger on the shinobi instead of the protagonist. Mentioning that a pure immortal was no match for him, he began launching a series of attacks at the shinobi, whose armor seemed to be melting. Satisfied, the bear remarked that if things continued like this, he could win easily. Attempting to land his final blow, the bear said he would end the fight. But at that moment, Park asked him to wait, and in a matter of seconds, something strange started to happen. Because that melted armor began to move toward the bear. It wasn't steel armor, but rather magic using malleable steel. Calling out for help from the protagonist, the bear said he needed cold energy. At that moment, the boy seemed to have an idea, saying he would help and soon send cold energy to him. Observing this, the spirit remarked that the energy felt familiar, appearing surprised by something. Suddenly, a gigantic spirit was standing before him. The bear, desperate, asked who had sent that spirit there, begging it to release him. The announcers, watching the scene, were utterly shocked, mentioning that the protagonist's technique was lighting up the entire area. Shortly after, the shinobi appeared, in tears, staring intensely at Park, thinking that it should be enough as losing was already humiliating and the man seemed tired. He was probably going to surrender. However, it wasn't the shinobi who spoke, but a woman beside him. An intimidating aura began to surround the woman, who said it was just a fight and, to be precise, an event created peacefully between both sides. Therefore, she didn't think they needed to risk the lives of two talents over this. Park, observing the situation, remained silent. Meanwhile, the two of the young man's companions watched the scene. The protagonist thought that this meant he was someone who couldn't die there, mentioning that the man was someone sick, as she had lent to the sanctuary. Then the lady said she felt ashamed, as she had felt pity for one of the participants, and thus had interfered in the fight between them. For that reason, they had the right to withdraw their participant from the fight. Observing this, Park seemed surprised. Yuwa, thanking them for their efforts, stated that the young man had won 3 times in a row. Because of this, she couldn't imagine he possessed such incredible skills and items. Park thought that even if she tried to compliment him, it was still quite humiliating, saying he could have done much better if he had been notified of the event earlier. The woman, on the other hand, asked what he was talking about. Park then said that thanks to her, perhaps he had gained more attention from the mortals, asking if she thought that, as an awakened one, they were just a bunch of idiots. Meanwhile, that shinobi, with a threatening look, watched the situation. Looking at the man, Park thought he felt sorry for him. Shortly after, he met up with another girl, who said he had done a good job, mentioning that it was a shame, but the protagonist said it was fine. However, the girl clarified that she wasn't talking about Park, because on artist shows people like him were called producers since, even though they had skills, they could be discarded in seconds. Park did his best and could have done much more, but it was better for the image of that boy, because Park plastically gave up with him. The protagonist thinks that if this were soccer, it would be like taking out a strong player who would definitely win the game. However, he was certain that the audience wouldn't celebrate this decision, given the drama that had unfolded so far. So, the boy says he didn't think she knew about those things, and she responds that you don't see much of that nowadays, but people talk a lot about it on social media, asking if it was strange to follow the world's trends. Park says it was strange, but respected her nonetheless. Meanwhile, the announcer began to introduce the next participants. But at that moment, the ground started to shake and a tsunami began to form. Above it, a man asked where the traitors who had disrespected his palace were. Seeing the situation, the protagonist didn't know what they were talking about, and the other girl said they were the sons of the Dragon King of Water. The other man then said he didn't want to hear any excuses because they dared to disrespect the dragon's laws, asking if they thought he wouldn't notice they were using the competition for hidden purposes, since their real goal was to exchange treasures away from the palace's eyes, so they would be kind if they handed over the traders. But he wouldn't fail to deliver his father's message. He demanded they return the 7-branched sword's axis they were carrying, and if they showed sincerity and offered apologies, his father might forgive them and return the items they brought to that place. However, those around seemed to disagree with all of it, so the man asked if that was their decision. Grabbing his weapon, he began to prepare for an attack, saying that all of them would be swallowed by the ocean and cast into the 7 seas, starting to unleash the ocean that had been contained. Park, watching this unfold, thought that everything had happened very suddenly, but he needed to take advantage of the situation and merge the axis with his sword. Soon after, he seemed to find the person he was looking for, thinking that if he could make the resonance between the two like before, it might work. But at that moment, a water dragon began to envelope the area. Submerged in the water, the protagonist thought that if things continued like this, he wouldn't be able to make it. So, he had no choice but to do it. He began to draw a magic sword. Feeling pleased that it worked, he quickly managed to escape the water. However, he ended up plunging back into the ocean. Thinking he didn't expect to be thrown back into the water again, he realized he needed to get out of that place soon. At that moment, a glow began to envelope the area, because the protagonist's sword seemed different. Park thought it was one of the strongest energies he had ever seen in his life, wondering if it was, by chance, the golden aura from the axis. It was probably because it had been held and sealed before, and that's why it had such overwhelming energy. Wondering if it wasn't too much energy, because it was even pushing his own energy. Because of that, it was too much power, and if it continued like that, his body wouldn't be able to withstand it, so he had to release the energy. However, he couldn't. He was shocked, thinking he had only struck once and already caused damage to spacetime. He was surprised because that magic seemed to be trying to engulf him, beginning to fall in that place. Sometime later, the protagonist ended up falling into an unfamiliar location. Looking around, he was astonished, wondering where he was. He supposed it was a space-time created due to the enormous power of that sword. It was worse than the garden gates that led to an entirely different dimension. Wondering if by striking another blow, he could return to the same place as before, but it was better to explore a bit before trying that. However, at that moment, he was struck by something. Before him, an unknown person was walking. Observing the man, Park seemed to recognize him. Supposing it was that shinobi from earlier. Thinking that the boy had been so enraged before that he had followed him to this place. Soon after, the boy stepped on the protagonist, and saying there were more tools in the world than he imagined, but at least he would let Park choose which one he would use. The protagonist, in turn, said he didn't know how to speak Japanese, so the boy told him to choose the tool for himself. Shortly after, a plan appeared beside Park. Pulling the plan out, Shinobi asked what Park was doing, calling him a weak coward. Even though he had won those battles, he hadn't done anything but send his spirits to fight in his place. Asking if Park thought he could do something with earth magic, the shinobi still intended to make the protagonist swallow his words. Park then asked what he was talking about. Right after, that plant transformed into something different. The shinobi seemed to start having hallucinations, eventually falling to the ground. Park told him he couldn't just touch anything he saw. But at that moment, blood began to gush from the shinobi's mouth, and soon after, he collapsed to the ground. Park said that he had managed to kill the shinobi. But even so, that was all there was to it. Shortly after, another person appeared, calling Park an idiot. Then the bear in human form said that every time he showed up, Park was completely wrecked. The bear mentioned that everything was fine, and that Park just needed to use an elixir to recover like he always did. However, the protagonist said that he could tell just by looking at his face and asked him to be honest with him. The spirit said it looked like that had been a critical blow to one of his kidneys. Park thought it felt like his energy was draining out of his body, and if things continued like that, he could lose all his energy, and not only that, but also his life. The spirit reminded him, once again, that he didn't need to endure everything alone. The bear mentioned that Deok had helped him before, and for that reason, Park should be fine since his core contained the energy of a supreme immortal, and the power Deok had given him still existed. Even before his transformation, the bear affirmed that Park had the dragon's blessing, a power that almost no one had, capable of even injuring divine and celestial beings. He questioned if the young man, who hadn't even lived for 100 years, already wanted to die. He added that it would be better for Park to be eaten by a bear than to die, lying like a sack of potatoes. The bear doubted that Deok would want the protagonist to die in such a humiliating way. Shortly after, the protagonist apologized for everything. Then, he began to fade away. Meanwhile, Yuwa was ordering one of her servants to leave that place, thinking that, eventually, she would kill him. She believed that those people knew absolutely nothing, that they must be savages, because the East Sea was her territory. Yuwa mentioned that they didn't even appreciate her kindness in getting rid of that man, and now they were raising their blades against her. Recalling the words of that man, the girl thought the Dragon King wouldn't ruin his celestial battle with such an absurd lie. She wondered where that old serpent had heard such things. It was trying to create a hero amid that celestial battle. Even though her plan to be worshipped by humans had failed, it wasn't completely in vain. For that reason, they should wait and see what would happen. That way, soon, all the heads of the Western Sea would be brought to her. Meanwhile, the protagonist was waking up, wondering how long he had been asleep. As he checked how his energy was flowing, he noted that his lower core should recover soon. As he regained consciousness, Park wondered what was going on. He questioned why there were horns on his forehead, and his senses seemed much sharper. But either way, not much time should have passed since the incident. He remarked that his body felt cleaner than he had expected. Looking around, he supposed someone had been taking care of him. He guessed it might have been the bear along with Sunbi. Wondering if he was still in the same place, because he had consumed the magic pearl using the bamboo fan, creating that barrier. For that reason, Sunbi might have been taking risks to take care of him. Opening a door, Park went searching for that girl, and then, he was surprised by what he saw. He wondered how that place had turned into a forest. He had built a shield there using his plants, but now the trees had grown immensely, leading him to suppose that a lot of time had passed. Looking to the side, he noticed that beyond the barrier, there was only destruction. He thought that those traces must have been left from a fight involving that girl. He wondered where she was. At that moment, he heard a noise. Quickly, he went to see where it was coming from. However, he was surprised. He noticed a house in the middle of that place. In front of him, a blue creature was lurking, and he realized it was his spirit. He remarked that it had grown significantly. Park asked why his spirit was so afraid of him, supposing it might be because of the horns. Then the spirit lunged at Park. However, Park easily dodged, telling the creature that it shouldn't bite its owner. At that moment, the creature seemed to realize that it was indeed its master, completely stopping the confrontation. Park remarked that it was very cute, mentioning that there wasn't much change in its energy even after eating the magic pearl, probably because it was using its strength to recover its inner core. Looking around, Park was surprised, noticing that his clothes were lying there. He wondered if there was something he could use. Additionally, he spotted a scroll. Reading it, Park questioned Shinobi. According to what the spirit had said during the competition, the crow crest of the Suzuki clan was one of Yagurasu's secrets. He speculated that these were the shinobi's clothes, wondering if they were the kind that had the ability to transform, since it was quite interesting just to wear them. Shortly after, the young man seemed to notice something, wondering what it was. He sensed that it was coming from the same place that had traces of a battle. Observing a group, Park wondered what they were doing since they were trying to break through the barrier. Noticing the color of their hair and their attire, he wondered if they were from that place. However, he was shocked by what he saw, thinking that it looked just like the goblin club that Gwonak had given him last time. Because it was so familiar, he realized they were a group of goblins. He didn't think there would be goblins in the space created by the seven-branched sword, guessing that this was their habitat. He wondered if they were trying to invade his territory. Seeing that the goblins were breaking through, the protagonist said he had to stop them. However, he was surprised by what he saw next. Behind those monsters, a person appeared. They asked who the boy was. However, it was Park standing before them. He asked which of the monsters was in command. Showing respect, the commander introduced himself as Tu, asking to be taken to the owner of the sword. However, the protagonist didn't understand what he was talking about, asking what he wanted with the owner of the sword. The goblin mourned that not just Hanyulm could go to that place. Only the sword's owner could do that. If Park didn't tell him where the owner was, he would surely kill the boy. However, Park said he couldn't tell him. He asked how he was supposed to say anything if the goblin didn't explain what he wanted with the man. The goblin said he wanted to find the man and punish him. Their king had made a promise that a man worthy of owning the place would come with a sword. But that man had never shown up. Park thought that he didn't know what was going on, but it seemed the seven-branched sword had some connection to that place. Frustrated, the goblins said they had waited too long for the promise to be fulfilled. Their leader passed it down from one generation to the next, and they had grown tired of waiting. That wretched man who was worthy of the sword deserved to be punished. The goblin demanded to be taken to him right then, threatening to cut off Park's head if he didn't comply. Park, observing the situation, remained silent. He then asked if the goblin had seen a red bear wandering around. The goblin responded that if it was what he was thinking, he had told it to undo the barrier. But it hadn't obeyed, and since this was their world, they had imprisoned it in one of their facilities. Park grew very angry upon hearing this, but he knew he had to stay calm. At least now, he knew where the bear was. He told the goblin that he was, in fact, the owner of the sword. However, the goblin called him a liar, saying that if Park wanted to get beaten up, he should just say so. Park was completely shocked by what the monster had said. The monster began hurling insults, claiming Park was too small and looked like someone who had never fought a day in his life. Embarrassed, the protagonist muttered that they were complete idiots. The monster then told Park that if he wasn't going to break the barrier for them, he should leave because they wouldn't kill him if he didn't get in their way. Grabbing his magic weapon, the protagonist grew increasingly angry, stating that they were underestimating him. He prepared to attack, ordering his spirit to spit at them. The monster, shocked by what had just happened, panicked and started to flee. In a matter of seconds, they were completely defeated. Park told them that if they continued acting like that, he would make them spit out more red beans. The group begged for him not to do that. The protagonist, impressed, thought that those creatures really hated red beans. He asked if their leader was strong. The goblin replied that she was mentioning that she wielded a staff like no one else. Park, however, questioned if merely knowing how to use a staff was enough to be strong. He demanded more information. The goblin added that there was one more thing. She had a golden treasure. Suddenly, a voice interrupted saying that the protagonist didn't need to know that. Above them, a figure with scarlet hair appeared. She scolded the goblins, calling them idiots for trusting just Hanyon like that. Seeing the woman, Park assumed she was the goblins' leader. She berated her subordinates for forcing her to come there and questioned how they could be so foolish, warning that this time they'd spend 10 years trapped in that place, seemingly transporting them into a divine item. Observing the scene, Park surmised that the item was the treasure the goblins had mentioned, and since she was their leader, she was probably very powerful. Because of this, he thought it best to start with his red bean attack. He launched an attack at the leader, but she dodged it swiftly. She praised the attempt, noting that it might have worked on her subordinates, but not on her. She commanded her spirits to emerge from the artifact. Park was surprised by her abilities, realizing she was stronger than he anticipated. He knew he had to be careful. He prepared another skill, and ordered his spirit to attack her. A massive battle ensued. The goblin leader asked what Park thought of her skill, as it had been a long time since she had this much fun. Park, deep in thought, remained silent, recalling a memory from his past, where someone claimed that a staff like hers could achieve anything. But now it seemed like a lie. The bear spirit remarked that it was called a goblin staff, capable of anything they could imagine. Since goblins weren't great thinkers, they relied on their instincts and had no strategy. Additionally, they had excellent physical abilities, thanks to their strong bones. Despite their simplicity, if they wanted, they could easily dominate the world. Returning to the present, Park wondered if the goblin leader's level of imagination was superior to the other fools he had encountered earlier, noting that she didn't seem to fear his red beans. He questioned what he could do in this situation. Glancing at the barrier, he thought it could work in his favor. But at that moment, the goblin leader asked what he was staring at, attacking him. Park barely managed to block her strike. She questioned why he was paying attention to anything else besides her in the middle of their battle. As he cut off her attack, Park stayed silent, quickly counterattacking her from behind, though she narrowly avoided it. The leader began summoning her spirits again, successfully hitting the protagonist. An explosion occurred and Park was thrown to the ground. The leader asked if he had reached his limit, and if they should finish things now. She said he should start begging for mercy. She ordered all of her spirits to attack him, thinking that once the fool screamed, she would trap him along with that bear. However, Park regained his strength, claiming that he who laughs last laughs best. He summoned wooden golems, each holding jars of red beans. They poured the beans onto the goblin leader, leaving her completely shocked. But the artifact she wielded seemed to absorb everything. Park remarked that she had been waiting for him to scream, but she had made a huge mistake. He grabbed the artifact and ordered the bear to come out. Immediately, the spirit emerged, saying it knew the protagonist would rescue it. However, it scolded Park for being an idiot and leaving it trapped long enough to feel sad. Park asked if the bear had any idea how long it had been trapped there. The bear said over 150 days had passed. Time worked a bit differently in that world, but wasn't drastically different. Park suggested that if that was the case, the best thing to do was to get out of there quickly. He then freed the goblins, trapped inside the artifact, questioning whether the woman was truly the leader of that place. Observing the protagonist, the goblin woman mentioned that he was short with broad shoulders. Leaving the young man completely embarrassed by her remark, he responded that he was of average height. The goblin then said that size didn't matter, and her mother had told her the same. At first, she thought it didn't make sense because Park had bested her in battle. Looking at him, the woman said he seemed smart and wasn't unattractive, so she had made up her mind. She asked the protagonist to marry her, leaving Park completely stunned by what he had heard. The spirit, amidst the situation, wondered if Park might actually get married and questioned how they would even formalize it, considering if everything would turn out fine. Confused, Park asked what she was talking about. The bear, meanwhile, asked if he hadn't yet realized that the goblins were connected to the seven-branched sword. Recalling the prophecy that the man had mentioned, Park thought this might be about that promise. A man would someday come with a certain type of sword. He supposed they were waiting for a man worthy of marrying her. However, Park said it had nothing to do with him, and the person who was supposed to come with the seven-branched sword was probably already dead. But the bear said that wasn't how the woman thought about it. Park figured he was too young and this had to be a dream, so he needed to wake up quickly from it. He asked the woman where she had hidden the sword and threatened to make her eat so many red beans that her belly would burst if she didn't tell him. He ordered her to speak immediately. But the woman refused to reveal anything, and said she wouldn't give the sword to the protagonist until she had given birth to 3 children with him. Park quickly ordered that they give her more red beans. The bear, watching the situation, remarked that he probably wouldn't get anything out of her that way. However, Park noted that goblins were incredibly stubborn, and it would be difficult to make them talk like this. So, the bear questioned why Park didn't just marry her right away. They had been stuck in that place for a long time, and probably didn't understand things properly, so Park should realize that he couldn't force them into anything. Besides, that artifact was their greatest treasure. The bear suggested that since time passed differently in that place compared to the real world, maybe Park should marry her and stay there for a while. Looking at the situation, Park thought that if he continued this way, he wouldn't get anywhere. Instead of intimidating her, he thought of bribing them. A little later, the goblin woman seemed to be waking up. She found herself tied up, and in front of her was a bit of food. At that moment, the protagonist noticed she had woken up. Once again, the woman declared that she wouldn't say anything until he married her. But Park replied that it didn't make a difference. He told her to think about what she wanted while he enjoyed the food. He mentioned how delicious the rice cakes were. Watching him eat, the goblin woman's desire for the food grew immense, and she admitted she wanted a piece too. Park threw one into her mouth, and she was immediately enchanted by the taste. She begged for another piece. With a mischievous look, a protagonist watched as she started devouring them all at once. The goblin then said that he shouldn't think this would make her agree to marry him just because of it. She still insisted that they had to have 3 children together. As she chewed the food, the protagonist mentioned there were only 2 rice cakes left. Tears welled up in the goblin's eyes as she pleaded for just one more. Then Park picked up another rice cake, leaving just one. He began to eat it, leaving the goblin completely disheartened, as she muttered that she just wanted to marry someone. Park said they could marry whenever they wanted, but he couldn't marry her at that moment. In disbelief, the woman said he wouldn't do this, and accused him of planning to say he'd marry her in 100 years, which was far too long for her. Offering her another plate, Park said he'd give it to her. He mentioned that he could even teach her how to make that kind of food herself. Holding her meal, the goblin woman seemed to accept the young man's offer. Amidst the situation, Park thought that he wouldn't mind marrying when he was 120 years old. A little while later, the goblin performed his spell to reveal a mysterious chest. Park asked if it was a treasure chest, and the goblin replied that she didn't know as her mother had only given it to her. She then started searching for something. After finding it, she handed it to the protagonist, telling him to take it. She mentioned that it would be a token of their engagement. Park asked when it was, and the wound responded that they were seeds. Confused, the protagonist wondered what he could do with them. He quickly became surprised. Nowadays, people no longer cared much about the stories of the Dakrasites. They only wanted to be remarkable, and if they got hold of something like that. However, goblins, for example, are honest about their possessive desires. They don't hold on to things, trading items and talents freely among themselves. But someone with valuable talents wouldn't part with them so easily. This often led to even more complicated situations. For that reason, negotiating with goblins by offering something they excelled at was the easiest way to get out of a situation like this. Taking the seed, the bear mentioned that it must be valuable in some way, asking the young man to inquire more about it from the goblin. Park wondered if he could keep something as good as that. He called the goblin, who affectionately referred to him as Love. Park then asked if those seeds came from a particular place. The one responded that her grandmother had taken them from her world before coming to that place. She explained that the former owner of the seed was one of the ministers, as she had mentioned. He was famous for cultivating herbs and medicinal plants and had traveled between worlds. However, he was forced to treat an incurable illness one day and ended up imprisoned, dying of starvation. So, he gave the seed to her grandmother in exchange for hiding the rest of his family. Park asked if he had been an herbalist. Reflecting, Park thought that the book he had been trying to decipher to create medicine was likely his. The goblin added that the man had worked for an extremely powerful figure. He wielded a sword and rode a horse, and people said his arrogance had pierced the heavens and leading to his eventual downfall. She asked if there had been a war at the time and things had turned bad. As a result, he gave the seed to her grandmother to remove his family from the battlefield. Park asked if that madman had dragged his family into war, and the woman confirmed it. He didn't want to suffer from their loss, so one could imagine what kind of man he was. Park reflected on the word loss. He thought it was even more disappointing than the suffering itself. The woman stood up, asking if they could continue. Park, observing the situation, urged her to calm down. Afterward, the woman took up her staff again. She began attacking the protagonist. Surprisingly, Park felt no pain at all. However, the woman said she was infusing something into him. Park mentioned that he wasn't feeling anything different. The goblin told him to relax, assuring him that he would eventually figure out how to use it to his advantage. Looking at the chest, Park thought that now all he needed was the seven-branched sword. Opening the box, he found the sacred sword inside. The bear remarked that swords of that level usually stored a lot of energy, but this one seemed quite different. Since its basic attribute was wood, there was no reason for Park to hesitate. Park replied that the contradiction of wood was precisely the earth. Even so, the bear insisted that no matter what happened, Park shouldn't stop. Seeing the energy of the bear urged him to go ahead with it anyway. At that moment, Park grabbed the sword and a giant beam of light enveloped him. He appeared to struggle with controlling the sword. The bear warned him not to let go of the sword under any circumstances. Park, irritated, asked if the bear thought he couldn't handle the immense power of the sword. The bear, astonished by what he was witnessing, mentioned that it was the first time he had seen Park like that, as the energy was now emanating even more powerfully. Right after that, the sword seems to calm down. The bear says that it was incredible, and it was as if he were watching the spirit of an elite general guiding the sword along with him. That's why he knew that the seven-branched sword was amazing. Park, on the other hand, thinks that he acted on instinct when he grabbed the sword, and it felt like he had been using it for a long time, assuming that must be the talent she had given him. He then asks the goblin if she wanted to get married at that moment. The scene then cuts to the protagonist's world city. That cheerful spirit mentions that it was very enjoyable. Park, on the other hand, thinks that it had been a long time since he had been to Korea. The protagonist wanted to have his spirit before, but during the fight against the goblin leader, he ended up using too much energy, so he came to the nearest city since he couldn't make it to Bear Mountain. Thinking that the goblin wanted to go with him, however, she was still very irresponsible, mentioning that it had been 7 months since his competition, and still many people were talking about it. Furthermore, since that incident, the Dragon King of the East Sea had not returned yet. Civilians and reporters started criticizing the invasion of the East Sea people without a valid reason. And they also began criticizing the 3 princesses of Korea for not saying a single word. However, a month later, the Dragon King appeared, apologizing, saying that it had been a mistake and a failure in the communication of the information received. But even so, no one was able to forgive either of the powers yet. The bear, on the other H, and asked what happened to the dragons of the West and South Seas. Then Park responds that he didn't want to get involved in that situation, as they might not have been on the side of the East Sea. The spirit, on the other H, and asserts that it was quite obvious, as they just wanted to cause a commotion for no reason. The relationship between the dragons wasn't very good. But they had once united, when there was a war between humans and mortals. Observing that situation, the protagonist thinks that there was still a problem, wondering where the seven-branched sword was, and the only thing they knew was that the protector of the sword had notified the Nordic Administrative Council to stay in Korea and participate in the subjugation of the East Sea. Thinking that this must be happening because he ended up grabbing it and going to another dimension. Mentioning that the man was extremely strong, and that he had a connection to that sword. Knowing that someone like him was looking for it made him even more anxious about finding his sword again. Then the bear responds that the East Sea had been really foolish, as even humans were starting to look at them with anger. Shortly after, a message informs that their time using the system had ended, thanking them for their preference. The bear, in turn, asks the young man what they were going to do next, and he responds that they had to go to Wannik Mountain. He was sure that he was on the list of missing or dead persons. And if he appeared out of nowhere, the garden would become very suspicious of it. For that reason, he's going to stay quiet and wait for the dust to settle while he watches the situation. Then the bear says that when they get there, he's going to take a look at his original body, as it had been a long time since he had felt its energy. That happened right after entering the dimension of those goblins, and he thought he would feel it again when he returned to that world. However, he felt nothing, and that's why he was becoming concerned. Surprised, Park wonders if it had been 7 months since the bear had felt energy in his body, asking if that wasn't too serious, and for that reason, they should leave immediately. And because of that, they head to the mountain at that moment. Sometime later, the two already seem to be near the destined place, completely surprised by what they had seen, absurdly. And with it, there were beehives. Surprised, Park wonders how those bees could penetrate that barrier. However, the bear says that everything was fine, as sometimes one insect or another could end up getting in. Observing a branch of leaves, the protagonist questions what that was. Then the bear seems to be in disbelief at what he had seen, as under that place another bear was resting. The bear, in turn, is surprised, mentioning that his original body was very strange, and for that reason, he didn't know what was happening. Shortly after, those bees seem to start attacking the two of them, so Park quickly pulls out his scroll along with his artifact, which begins to summon all his spirits. Ordering his spirits to attack those bees, a battle with them begins. However, for Park, there were too many of those bees and he thought they were very difficult to kill, even using his abilities, and for that reason, he needed something stronger. Then shortly after, the bear ends up awakening his true form and begins to charge at those bees. Park in turn asks him to wait, but the spirit says that he could let him take care of all of them with his fire, and if it weren't for their hive, he would have attacked with all his strength. But he couldn't hurt the tree, as it was simply infested with those bees, wondering if there was any other way to get everything off that tree. Park, on the other H, and ponders over a situation that might work, while watching those bees on the ground, assuming that they had not been killed even after being attacked, and in the same moment, he seems to have an idea about a good plan.